meeting.
Very welcome. Good. Thank you, Janet. Item 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendation set out item 2, and again as ever to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests and other interests that are not there detailed. Thank you very much. Item 3, can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 29th of November and the 12th of December to be signed by me as correct record. Thank you. Item 4, can I ask the committee to note the complete and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings. Thank you. Item 5, action under delegated authority. Can I ask the committee to note the recent action taken by me following consultation to agree a letter sent to the Mayor on the Violence Reduction Unit, a copy of which is within the appendix of the papers. Thank you very much. Right, so the main bulk of the meeting this morning. Again, main item of business. Welcome very much Deputy Mayor Sophie Linden, and very much welcome Sir Steve Howes on his first appearance with the Police and Crime Committee. Thank you very much. You may have been in front of us before, but this is your first time you're in this capacity in front of me. So again, very much welcome. I hope the predecessor we had a very good relationship with, mutual respect. Sir Craig worked well with us, and I've no doubt that that will continue with yourself. And as I mentioned earlier, the committee will be delighted to have a private meeting with you to talk about your priorities, and that is to be arranged in due course. We have a set of questions this morning, but we have a couple of items that are of topical note, and they are this. This is, you would have seen the issue around demonstrations outside the House of Commons and certain behaviours by certain demonstrators causing concerns there. And a second issue is around the, shall we say, announcement of if there was a potentially no deal, and it's taken me about 2 minutes to mention Brexit before other colleagues possibly, the possibility that there may be a hard border in Northern Ireland, the possibility that there will be support in numbers from the Met. So these are two issues of topic that I think we would like to hear from you, and you may, Len, do you want to ask a question?
I can, indirectly, I don't wish to take up too much time, and I understand why the precautionary actions being taken by the Chief Police Officers Association, and it's right that we support other police services in times of woe. So, let's start with that point. But in terms of the 1,000 potential obstructions, of course, the Met is the largest police service in the UK. There will be a proportion then, I think, an expectation that we provide that. Training begins this month. What I think this committee needs to understand is, how have those people been identified? Have you asked for volunteers, or have you identified issues? What are we doing to backfill those potential spots if they are actually, if we get a request from the police service of Northern Ireland? How are we doing that and all the rest of it? Can you also give an indication, roughly, of the numbers that are undertaking the training this month? That may not necessarily mean they'll be required, I accept that, but if we have an idea of what our contribution may be of the 1,000 in the event of no deal or trouble occurring in parts of the UK that we are required to support.
Take that topic first, if you don't mind, Sir Steve, make a comment.
So
let's see the response first.
The other question, I think, is how long does the training take? Because presumably you've got to take officers out of circulation to undergo the training.
I'm sure that would have been covered. So Steve, over to you.
First thing to say I think is important is that we have had no request to provide any officers to assist in Northern Ireland. So there's nothing on the table at this moment in time. But as you rightly phrase in your question, it's right to anticipate that we may be asked. And nationally, the numbers that are being looked at are, I think, 1,000 officers, as you say. We're anticipating training 150 officers who will be trained in tactics. My understanding is the course takes 2 days to upskill officers. We don't ask for volunteers, because what we're using is we use our officers already trained in public order. So they've already got high level of training in public order. We give them additional training in relation to tactics they may need to work with in Northern Ireland, and then they are able to be deployed. if required, if there is a request. Probably worth, just for context, saying, yes, you're right, of course we are the largest force by some margin in the UK, therefore you would expect a high proportion to come from us. That is slightly, that situation is slightly altered by the fact that Police Scotland, which of course is the second largest force in the UK, is geographically closest, has a lot of links with PSNI, and has a lot of officers already trained in PSNI tactics, and they will supply a disproportionately high number of officers to PSNI. So we would probably provide less than we would normally expect to because of that input from Police Scotland. In terms of backfilling, in all candour, that number of officers wouldn't necessarily all go at the same time. We may phase that, so just for detail, 150 officers are made up of 6 inspectors, 18 sergeants and 126 constables. The reason I can be precise on those figures is that's effectively 6 police support units. So we wouldn't necessarily provide all 6 at any one time. We might provide a phase 2 at any one time, or 3 at any one time. How long they would be for would probably be dependent upon the requirements and how long the situation was going on for. If it was an extended period of time, then quite clearly at a national level, people would have to look to see how sustainable the numbers are. And it would also depend on what else is going on around the rest of the United Kingdom.
Okay. And the subject of the demonstrations?
Sure. I've got a question on that.
Yes, I was going to say, yeah, do you want to...
So if we move on to the questions demonstration, my understanding is that it's law that police officers enable parliamentarians to carry out their duties. I just want to put that as a marker down. Correct me if I'm wrong. The reasons why I think the events, it's about it's the fine line between legitimate process and stopping people carrying out their duties or trying to interfere with carrying out their duties. And I'm not sure where we are in terms of policing and the instructions we're giving to police officers, and in some of the events I've seen in the media which has been aimed at police officers, where people have been to really cross that line, both. And I think there is an issue, and I recognise this is not just, this is happening on both sides of this debate about that. I recognise that. I want it policed evenly, even with people that may disagree with my particular views. So, there's an issue about that. But what is the line that the police, is there been, in terms of issuing new instructions about, intervening when laws are potentially broken? Because that's what you do. And all the rest of it. So please explain the Met's position.
The Met's position is that the basic guidance that they follow is the law of the land, which lays out a variety of different offences within public order. We have enhanced that to officers because, as you say quite rightly, it's a delicate situation. There is a very fine judgment to be made in terms of allowing people to go about lawful expression of their views whilst not preventing other people going about their lawful business. And whether it's an MP going into Parliament or anyone else going about their job, people have got an absolute right to go about their lawful daily lives without impediment from people. But that is clearly a balance, and clearly outside Parliament we're seeing it tested to the extreme limit. I think it's important to say that there are a number of cases that we have referred to the Crown Prosecution Service in relation to what's been going on over the last few days, and that is being considered by the Crown Prosecution Service now, so I can't comment on specific cases, and it would be wrong for me to do so. But we have deployed officers down to Westminster. We've seen as we would expect, I guess, for the political situation, an increase in numbers of demonstrators and an increase in the passion exhibited by demonstrators on both sides of the debate over the last few days, mainly since the return to Parliament, I guess, after the Christmas and New Year break. So we have increased the number of officers down there, and they are under clear instruction that no member of the public is to be impeded from going about their lawful business. Which brings us back to the central crux of the problem, which is MPs going about their lawful business, but also people lawfully demonstrating, but I would underline lawfully demonstrating, and that's what we're asking the CPS to test with the 3 cases that they're looking at.
Keep us informed of that ongoing debate, because I think there is an issue of that. I don't think anyone wants to stifle legitimate protesting, people letting their views know, but I think there is an issue about when does that legitimate protest become an intimidation. Can I then move on to another side of this debate, which I know is exercising the police and getting some understanding of here, because I've been following some of the individuals who've been involved in those events outside Parliament and been involved in events outside this building, and their manipulation of social media. Now, I'm coming to the view that they're no different to Adam Chowdhury in the way that they encourage and incite others who may not have the full information to move across to that fine line between I am a concerned citizen and I'm very upset by what's going on in the world and in terms of domestic politics, I then cross the line to take up violence against other people. Can you assure me that those individuals that are carrying out some of the events that we saw the other night, who are prominent on social media, are being monitored in the same way that I'd want you to monitor Adam Chowdhury because of their hatefulness and their potential incitement to cause others that lead to violence? I think we just need to understand whether that's the case, because they are no different. They're no different in terms of, over the weekend, I was following some of the fake information, the misleading issues, and understanding what it could be doing that someone else on the other end of that screen listening to some of these comments being made by these individuals and thinking, actually, I've given up on the legitimate protest, I'm going to do something more, because I don't think, because the key issue, I don't think they're listening to me.
Okay, so I can reassure you that social media comments and ongoing dialogue by a number of individuals is being monitored by the police and does form part of the investigations that we're carrying out.
And should it be forming part of that conversation that we have with the carriers of these messages and getting them to understand the potential of what, and it's not about denying free speech, it's where there is real evidence that points to, and we know we've had evidence in the past around the use of social media, of where people get themselves worked up and then carry out terrorist activities. How do we get the carriers of social media to understand their responsibilities, not just in terms of where we're clarifying the issues of the law about some of these issues? And don't we need some sort of dashboard now about monitoring where the potential, some of these messages which are not underpinned by factual information? They're not, you know, it's quite clear. Some of the things being said on the social media is not that lead to it. We see that in terms of some of the terrorism challenges you face, in terms of how they do it. It's an interpretation that they place on information, and it's a misleading interpretation. And it's no different with these characters that have been doing what they've been doing the last couple of days and from the weekend.
I think I would want to draw a distinction, Len, if you don't mind, between somebody putting out misleading information or even fake news, and somebody inciting violence or racial hatred, etc. We're interested in the latter. When we wouldn't focus so much on the fake news.
But I do think the operators of the sites would, and one of those discussions is about where that leads to, and it's the blurring of the lines again, and that's the point I'm trying to make. But I do agree with you. What you need to concentrate is the ones that lead to incitement of violence, and that clearly should be your priority.
Okay.
I agree.
Thank you. Andrew, you've got a brief additional question?
Just to follow up the point about Parliament, I don't recall from my time as an MP that there was a specific duty on the police to facilitate members' access to Westminster, and also that it was an offence for people to obstruct an MP attempting to get to the Commons.
Are you saying you don't recall that?
No, I do recall that.
Yeah. So,
I mean, beyond the general duty which you outlined.
it's an offence for people to obstruct anyone. Effectively, it's a case of how they go about doing that. We are looking at is there specific legislation in place, and indeed it's a matter for the Home Office and the Home Secretary to look at. Is there specific legislation that could be put in place around greater protection? What we've made clear, I mean, I think it's important, I'm sure you realise, we are having daily liaison meetings with a number of stakeholders in relation to the issues around Parliament to make sure that we can facilitate people going about their lawful business, and specifically people working, not just MPs, but aides and other people working within Parliament can get in and out and are not in any way alarmed by what's going on, whilst we try to maintain the ability of people to carry out lawful demonstrations. But I underline the lawful demonstration bit.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'm just questioning because from my recollection, there are those two specific provisions in the law beyond the general law which you've outlined. Yeah, there already.
Okay. Thank you for that. Both those subjects, obviously, the committee will continue to take an interest in. Turning to the bulk of the questions. The bulk of the questions this morning, particularly around tackling violence. We enter a new year and reflect on last year, 132 homicides. It was a particularly bad year for London in that context and others. And the new year started, and tragically only a couple of days ago we lost a child, 14 years in Waltham Forest, which I think is a tragedy. Hence this needs to be the number one issue on the Mayor's desk and probably the desk of this committee and the Met's desk, particularly in the coming year. Now, the initiative that we heard of launched last year was the VRU, the Violence Reduction Unit. And I've got some questions around that. But before we turn to that, I'd like to talk about the other initiative, which is the Crime Task Force, the Violent Crime Task Force. And again, colleagues in the committee went out on patrol with them last year, and we've seen an impact by that force in the crime level. So, first of all, Deputy Commissioner, can you tell us about your plans around the continuation of that particular task force?
Well, firstly, can I agree, Chair, with your comments, be in no doubt that the number one issue for the Commissioner and for the Met is to reduce violence across London, violence in all its forms, but there is a particular focus on knife violence within many parts of London. And yes, the murder a couple of days ago of Jaden Moody, who we shouldn't make any bones about it, is not a young man, he's a 14-year-old child. Was a horrific start and a real shock to, I think, everybody, even those of us that have been around this sort of thing for decades. So it's the number one priority for the Met. It will continue to be so, and therefore the Violent Crime Task Force will be a unit that will continue as long as the Commissioner has a view that it is required, which means our view, sadly, is that it's got a future for some while to come.
Okay, thank you very much. The staffing of that, particularly around additional officers from the Transport Policing Command. Yeah. Do you want to sort of expand upon that sustainability?
Yeah, sure, I can do. At the moment, we have an agreement brokered with the Mayor and with TfL that up until, I think, the end of March is the date that the extra officers from the Transport Command will form part of the Violent Crime Task Force. We will at some point in the next month, I guess, reconsider that. Yeah. I would be expecting very confidently to be going back to the Mayor at this moment in time to ask that we continue that redeployment. I can't speak for the Mayor, and I don't want to, but I think it's everybody's number one priority. The deployment has worked extremely well. So it was done initially for a short period to see whether or not this would add value. I think it's added value enormously. So I would anticipate it continuing. I was out on patrol with the Violent Crime Task Force before Christmas, and I know members have been out with them as well. I think they are effective and extremely well led and well targeted, and we do see good results from them. I think it's important. The Commissioner's number one measure she looks at, and you can understand why, is knife injuries in under 25s that exclude domestic abuse. The most recent figures we have for that are that on the rolling 12 months it's down nearly 15%. So we are seeing a reduction in that field. We're not seeing reduction everywhere, so I wouldn't want anyone thinking, oh, we're on the right trajectory. There are other areas that are not quite as positive as that. But in general, that is an encouraging picture which we want to see continuing. And Violent Crime Task Force plays a large part in that. I don't want to underestimate the contribution from all other parts of the Met, because there's a tendency to over-focus sometimes, think, well, it's all the Violent Crime Task Force. You know, officers deploying on response teams and in neighbourhood teams on all the DCUs across London are focused on this. So are all the roads policing officers, the territorial support group, etc., etc. It's a focus for the whole organisation. But the Violent Crime Task Force is undoubtedly carrying a huge weight on it at the moment, a weight of expectation from the Commission.
I think. You know, we were very much impressed as a committee by the professionalism of that task force. But your point is a good one. First of all, that violence is not just it's a complex area, and you mentioned domestic violence, and that is something again the committee is taking a keen interest in. And the difficulty is that the level is already high from last year. And then again, you have a reduction, and then you have events like a couple of days ago. So it's a complex matter, and I'm pleased it is that number one priority. Moving on to a linked subject of the Violence Reduction Unit. The committee has written, as I said earlier, to the Mayor just before Christmas with a lengthy letter with comments and recommendations. And I know it was the subject of the Budget Committee scrutiny a couple of days ago. So Deputy Mayor, do you want to give us an update on where you are on the setting up of the unit, please?
Absolutely, but before I do that, can I just reiterate what the Deputy Commissioner said around how awful the incident with Jaden Moody has been, and it really was a real shock that such a young child can lose their life on the streets of London. And to, he wasn't going to speak on behalf of the Mayor, but I will speak on behalf of myself and the Mayor. It is, as you know, the absolute number one priority is tackling violence and bringing down the murders that we're seeing in London. We are in no way complacent about the huge amount of work that needs to be done. And that's not just by the Metropolitan Police, but by partners as well. And that leads me into the Violence Reduction Unit, because our decision to set up the Violence Reduction Unit, it was taken because we knew that the Metropolitan Police are absolutely prioritising violence, and that enforcement aspect being incredibly important for that short-term reduction in violence that we are seeking and is beginning to bear some fruits. But that what we needed to put in place as well and build on our public health approach, which was in the knife crime strategy, was a longer-term partnership with added capacity and added value, and that is the setting up of the Violence Reduction Unit. As you know, the Mayor announced that we were going to do that in September. We have been working extremely hard and extremely quickly to set that up. We are at the closing stages of recruiting a director for the Violence Reduction Unit. That will be an important appointment, but the team itself of the unit will be just as important. We have set up a partnership reference group which has met twice, and that is all very transparent and accountable. And I've seen from your letter that you sent to the Mayor that you have carefully read the papers that have gone to it in terms of its priorities, its actions, and what it's being asked to advise on. That reference group is of partners, including community partners, voluntary sector, London funders, NHS. It is wide-ranging because the unit itself has to encapsulate the whole of the partnership. We are working on, we have had a number of workshops with practitioners on what that model will look like for the unit. We've had discussions already here around my vision of what that unit will look like. When the director is in post, we'll be working with him or her to put that in place as quickly as possible. The Mayor in his budget consultation has set aside £6.8 million for the Violence Reduction Unit next year. That isn't £6.8 million to be spent on on people in the unit. It is money to be transferred out of the unit and into services for early intervention and prevention, and that's on top of, within the Mayor's budget consultation, £3 million to maintain some of the services that and the pilots that were ongoing around information sharing to tackle violence as well.
Okay. I mean when would we expect to see the director appointed or in place? it's difficult to say, but are we talking about the first quarter that we're in, actually?
So we're in the closing stages. The deadline for applications was before Christmas. We're in the closing stages of that process. It will depend on who that person is, about how quickly they'll be able to get into place, because obviously there's different notice periods and things like that. But we hope to be able to have that person in place as quickly as possible.
I mean, I understand the time it does take, but the Mayor's allocated 6.8 million in the next year's budget from April onwards to be spent at that time. That money is going to be passed on to many of it to outside bodies who would have to bid for it and procure for it, etc. And that all takes time, doesn't it? You'd agree. Are you concerned about the delays and the time this will take?
The work around priorities and commissioning and services, we are, within MOPAC at the moment, we are working on that. It doesn't mean that we are waiting for a director to come in before that work can start. We have a lot of experience, a lot of evidence, and a lot of good practice in terms of our commissioning. In the same way with the Mayor's Youth Fund and the Community Seed funding, that was announced in the budget, the Mayor's Youth Fund, and we got money out the door extremely quickly and projects and programmes up and running extremely quickly. It is a challenge, but we have proven, and the City Hall has proven, that we can do this quickly last year, and we'll do it again quickly this year.
I mean, the committee and others support very much the concept of adopting a longer-term view on it, on the public health approach view, but that does, in the words of the Mayor, may well take, his own words, 10 years to see a real benefit. At the moment, we are losing young people, and I think there is a parallel issue, isn't there? So we need the issue to get these people taken off the streets and with a firm hand from the Met, but also take a keen interest in the unit that you're forming. So we will take an interest in that. Obviously, the letter from the committee is very detailed, with lots of questions, and we would expect a response by the end of the month, I think.
No, of course.
Which,
go on. Of course, and I've obviously read your letter, and there's much in there that we absolutely agree on and are already undertaking in terms of that. Okay. I agree with you about the, in terms of the importance of immediate action. That's why the Mayor put £15 million for the setting up of the Violent Crime Task Force, and also why he's put the extra money from business rates into the Metropolitan Police, so that it's not only the Violent Crime Task Force, but actually an increase in police officer numbers from the business rates. And that's for the immediate action and immediate reduction. The violence reduction unit is there to underpin that and to ensure that that's not just, we don't continue to see the up and down and fluctuation in violence, but we see a long-term fall starting now, which we are beginning very early stages to see. But as I said before, we're absolutely not complacent because of the level of murders that we've got.
Okay. I mean, we'll await the response from the Mayor, and then when we get the response, the committee will then be able to act and respond equally to that. Florence.
Thank you, Chair. So the Chair rightly mentioned the tragic death of Jaden, who is a child. I think one of the other areas which sometimes doesn't get the attention and is very worrying is domestic violence deaths. So at the meeting on Tuesday, the Mayor highlighted that 3 out of the 4 homicides this year are domestic violence related. There was a young girl that was fatally stabbed just at the end of December in Clapham, in Lambeth, an 18-year-old, and the first tragic death of this year was 33-year-old Charlotte Huggins in Camberwell. And I think, the impact of young women losing their lives and the impact it leaves on a number of kids who are now having to grow up without mothers is one that, we should be looking at how we address this really tragic thing. Is there something, and I did ask you this a few months ago in terms of violence reduction unit and specific focus on domestic violence, but will there be more focus on this area in 2019? Because I don't have the figures to hand, but my understanding is that the figures for 2018 on domestic violence deaths were a lot higher.
So in terms of the violence reduction unit, and I've always been clear, and you've said in your letter as well that would be your expectation, but it has always been and is very clear in the papers for the violence reduction unit when we made the announcement to set it up, that it is violence in all its forms, and that for me is around domestic violence and sexual violence. That yes, there's a priority and a focus on street violence rightly, but actually we have to deal with the domestic violence as well, and it has increased last year. It was 27 domestic violence murders last year, a shocking number of women losing their lives in London, mostly women losing their lives in London. So the violence reduction unit is absolutely within its scope, is for domestic violence, and that's rightly so, but also as part of as you would expect, my concern is, well, what has happened last year? Why have we had that increase? We have had discussions with the Metropolitan Police and Martin Hewitt in particular, looking at a quick look at the cases from last year to see if there are any lessons to be learned. And in terms of the quick work of the Violence Reduction Unit around the review of homicides and cases, serious cases, that will also look about whether we need to, what is coming out of the domestic violence homicides that we've seen, so that we are ensuring that the work is for the street violence and the stabbings, but also the domestic violence.
Okay.
Just on a wider issue and about the trends of violence and actually the bail terms given to people and those who assist in violent activities. So one of those incidents occurred, and I don't want to mention a specific case because that's ongoing, but one of the bail issues, the person who assisted the alleged murderer, which I think it's more than alleged because it's the nature of the crime, was given bail. And shouldn't we be sending out stronger messages about some of those bail's terms and conditions? So if I turn the question about violence per se, are we giving proper instructions to custody officers taking decisions in relation to people convicted of violent crime, or are there associates that help them with it? Murder is the upper extreme, but there's other potential violent situations of where, are we using it to the full potential of putting conditions on individual to understand that in that interim time before we get to the courts, that the community may well be protected, that they've been associated with something that's so bloody outrageous and wrong, because there is an issue about us not being complacent about violence, and we want to send that message. What are we doing about it? Can you assure us, or can you tell us that you look into it and see if we can do a bit more about it? Because I just think it's one of those grey areas where we could be sending strong messages, but also protecting communities.
I'm assuming that's... we can all furiously not discuss the case you're talking about, and I know what the case was, and I can understand why you asked the question in relation to that case. I do know the circumstances of it, and I applaud the actions of the officers as they arrived at the scene, because they were faced with a homicide and they decided that they would deal decisively with that. They did. It then made the bail decision, I think, look quite, crikey, what's that about? Actually, I think the bail decision was appropriate in the circumstances, and there has been a further arrest in relation to that murder since. And that's one of the difficulties I would sort of put forward for officers. They're attending hugely traumatic situations, seeing the worst things that anyone can ever see, and then immediately being asked to make some split-second decisions, sometimes on a very chaotic situation. And then, I'm not suggesting you're doing this, Len, I know you're not, and I'm not, but then we look in hindsight, well, why did you do that? Well, they did it because they thought that was the right thing to do at the time. So going back to I don't think they did anything wrong. Going back to the bail situation, we take each bail decision separately. It's made by the custody staff and the sergeants, sometimes in discussion with more senior people, and they will often talk with CPS about these situations as well. It's important, I agree with you, it's important that we use bail decisions, whether to give somebody back their liberty or not, as an important indicator of how seriously society takes violent offences. And that is something which, frankly, we should always be ready to review and look at. As you know, there is work ongoing within the Met at the moment around the released under investigation issue versus the bail issue, and the recent legislation that the government has brought in relation to that, which sort of changed the landscape quite significantly. And we have therefore changed our stance, driven by the legislation, on the number of the percentage of time we give bail. And that is now, people are released more now than they probably were in the past. But we are reviewing all that, and I'm happy to come back to the committee in due course with more information on that. But to emphasise, we do take the bail decisions as an important indicator of how seriously we take violence, and if there is any expectation of repeat violence, then bail should not be given.
Thank you, that's helpful. Jeanette.
Chair, thank you for your indulgence, and I just wanted to say it would be inappropriate for me as the representative of North East London not to say a few words about the recent tragic death of the young man on the streets of my constituency, but also say that it is regrettable that a young woman died over the New Year's Eve in the neighbouring borough, not that far away from this area. And so it was, you know, we all send our condolences. We all send, and I certainly send my thoughts and prayers to the family of this young man and his friends. But I just wanted to ask the Deputy Mayor, given what we know about this locality, and given that people have got to go about their business, because this is an area, much like most of London, law-abiding people going about their business, how are you going to ensure that you maintain community confidence in terms of the policing of this and other tragedies in this area?
Thanks, Jeanette. And just to reiterate, I mean, my youngest son's 15, and the idea of a 14-year-old boy losing their life is just shocking for everybody, but especially when you've got, you know, children that very similar ages. And my thoughts and prayers absolutely go out to the family as well. In terms of trust and confidence in the police, it is a concern, especially in areas where they have sort of repeat incidents and repeat violence. And that's something that I've been discussing with the Metropolitan Police Service, as well as the local council and the leader of Waltham Forest in particular, and the Member of Parliament, because that is absolutely of concern. Part of improving and increasing trust and confidence is the response, and very good response of the Metropolitan Police around the incidents and murders when they do happen, around the extra police and resources that do go into the area, but also the information and the community engagement that happens. But that shouldn't just be, and I know we all agree a bit with this, shouldn't just be when there is such an awful incident of a murder. It has to be ongoing and continuous, and that's about the neighbourhood policing, the dedicated ward officers, the safer schools officers, really important bridge between young people, well, not a bridge, really important channel from the police officers and young people in schools. So that's part of the strategy that ourselves from the Mayor's Office, but also the Metropolitan Police have around that issue of trust and confidence. And we know we've discussed many times here and with yourself around there are disparities in particular communities, particularly among young black men, around that trust and confidence, and we need to always continue to work at it, and that is around a regular, consistent police presence.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, and thank you for those answers. The next subject is around armed patrols and potential change in tactics. This was subject of discussion back in November, which sprang from a consultation letter that mentioned, quoting it perhaps, the potential use of armed foot patrols, and there was an exchange between the committee and yourself, Deputy Mayor, and the Commissioner around that specific change of tactics that I think at that stage was denied that was the case, but the fact remains there was a consultation piece around that. Susan, you're going to lead on this set of questions, aren't you?
Yes, I was going to say that, Chairman, in fact. So how likely are we to see a change in tactics going forward?
There's been no change in the tactics so far. We have carried out some limited consultation with community groups, and we've had the results back from that. The Commissioner will speak to the Mayor again in due course about this. I think I want to reiterate that we see this as a very limited, and I would have to say in brackets, more limited than has come across, I think, in our communications. A very limited addition to tactics that would be carried out only after an outbreak of violence or in anticipating an outbreak of violence in a limited geographic area with the agreement and understanding of the local BCU commander, and would be limited in its time scale and particularly in its geography. So I think what perhaps we've got wrong, and I take responsibility for that, is we've given the impression of officers, armed officers, on foot patrol through communities. That was not and never will be the situation. Not least because of the practicality that the number one duty of these officers is to work as armed response vehicle crew. And that means that they have to deploy at a minute's notice to any armed incident or otherwise so dangerous incident that an armed response would be appropriate. And it's an instantaneous response that we expect in these situations. So we would not countenance them moving very far away from their vehicle anyway. They have to be close to the vehicle so that they can be deployed. So the concept of them going off on a foot patrol for 5 or 10 minutes through an estate is not what was intended. What was intended almost was that they get out of their vehicle and stand near the vehicle so that they are seen and able to redeploy with the vehicle instantaneously. But there has been no deployment as such of that. There are no immediate plans to do that because we don't have the intelligence about an outbreak of violence and we haven't had a spontaneous event. What we have, of course, is in response to the horrible murder of Jaden Moody, we did reinforce the number of armed response vehicles in that part of London, as I think members might expect us to do. But they were doing that in their existing role of responding in a vehicle and being in a vehicle ready to deploy.
Yes, I mean, I've been out with the armed response team there for a whole shift. They're a fantastic body of officers. I think with respect, where you got it wrong was to consult some people because we didn't know anything about it. We're still the deputy mayor. Didn't know anything about it, so then people make all sorts of assumptions.
I think with respect you're correct. Yeah.
Great, well I'll leave it at that then when I'm ahead. Okay, Deputy Mayor, moving swiftly. Since our last meeting when Deputy Mayor, what involvement have you had in these discussions and what would be your view on this potential change in tactics?
Well, myself and the Mayor have discussed with Deputy Commissioner and the Commissioner what, exactly what he's just set out in terms of some of the engagement that he's had. But we all agree, and he's said it today as well, that this is, last time it was at very early stages of discussions. We've had those discussions. I agree, I believe, and the Mayor believes, as the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner, that armed patrols should always be the exception, not the norm. And as he has said very clearly already, he'll be coming back after the discussions that they have had to have that discussion and consultation with the Mayor.
Okay, thank you.
So now we've established that the communication wasn't right, what's the lessons and what are we going to do about that in the future, about where there is a real departure from existing police tactics, whatever the reasons for, there may well be evidence issues of how we're going to communicate that, how we're going to get better. The political process is one side. Much like I'm part of that and I welcome a change in that, I'm more interested about how the police are going to engage in terms of the notion, policing by consent, about major changes. I don't want to give away the secrets and tactics to the bad people that want to cause us harm, but I do want, and I do think it's justified, that people that you're serving and protecting know what is happening in terms of their policing, and in some cases, the why certain things need to happen, whether it squeezes on resources or it requires a different change of tactic.
Okay. Can I just start off by saying, and I think you know in terms of the shared history that we have going back in my previous time in the Met, that the Met has learned painful lessons around having a situation where tactics were kept secret from the public, only to be used in the streets, and then the public going, well, what's this about? And we have learned over the decades that we may be slow learners, but we do learn. That actually that's a very counterproductive way of going about it. So you had my personal assurance that I think what we did was we got the consultation timings and phasing wrong. We were trying to consult. It wasn't that we were trying to keep things to ourselves. We just got that wrong. And as I say, I'm happy that I'm the one that carries the responsibility for getting that bit wrong. Our commitment is to consult on major changes, certainly to inform and talk to the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor in relation to that. I do have to, and I'm sure the Commissioner would want me to, put in the caveat, though, that where it is clearly an operational decision, then that will be carried out. Wherever possible, we will discuss that operational decision with the appropriate representatives of the public as well. Sometimes that's not possible for a variety of reasons. But wherever it's a change of policy, or indeed a change of tactics that can be discussed in slow time, we would wish to discuss that and bring that forward, which is the benefit of us appearing in front of you to be reminded of that public duty, because I think it is a public duty. You quite rightly talked about policing by consent. It's something that I know you realise we take very seriously, and the Commissioner is very rigorous about in relation to how we go about our duties. So you have my assurance we will try and do that on all occasions, and if we make mistakes again, we will hold our hands up and say we've made a mistake, but we hope that with your guidance we won't make those mistakes going forward.
Thank you. I mean, I think the committee and on behalf of Londoners will agree that it's right that the Met looks at all opportunities to keep them safe, and I think it's a shame that this sort of consultation breakdown has kind of blurred that debate a little bit. But thank you for discussing that. Now, the next subject, again, gangs matrix. The Mayor recognised that there is issues around the gangs matrix, and his strategy committee to review said matrix, and published the review just before Christmas. We have the details of that. I think to simplify the conclusions was that it was right and legal that it's in place, but needed a deep look at and an overhaul to be published and responded at the end of this calendar year. But Jeanette, you're leading on the questions on this.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And can I just say, this issue is something that I've pursued, but it comes from way back, and it comes from our time on the Metropolitan Police Authority when this was first thought up. And the concerns that were raised and identified in the report were similar, same as the concerns that we had then. So I would ask the both Sir Stephen and the Deputy today, let's focus on those concerns and recommendations, because never, and I don't know any colleague saying that they are against a tool that is proper and appropriate and can demonstrate what it says on the tin, if you like. What we've always been concerned, what this report shows, is that this is such a strong tool that if it isn't implemented, if people don't have the understanding, then there are serious consequences. And we know that that there is a court case currently outstanding at the moment for a serious breach about somebody's data. So, based on the recent review, Sir Stephen, how confident are you in terms of accepting the critique, and can you tell us now about the recommendations that are in that MOPAC report and how you're going to implement them?
So I would firstly welcome the fact that you, and it's not news to me, I obviously know that you support a legal tool used appropriately and properly to try and protect the public, and that's effectively what we believe the gangs matrix is. Is it a perfect tool? Clearly it's not. So we've had in recent months the Information Commissioner's review and report into it, and we've accepted those recommendations fully. We work, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, on a weekly basis through contact with the Information Commissioner to put in place the fixes to the recommendations they've made, and we fully accept that the data was not being handled as it should have been. In relation to the Mayor's report, we worked tirelessly, I have to say, knowing the people that did it, to try and almost anticipate the recommendations that were coming from the Mayor's report into the gangs matrix, to try and put fixes in place as soon as possible. We accept the Mayor's report. I mean, it is an extremely detailed and extremely well argued and reasoned report. I mean, I think anyone who's read it, as I have, It's lengthy, it's incredibly detailed. I have to say some of the statistical analysis was extremely detailed, and you had to be pretty expert to understand, I think, some of it. We were reassured and encouraged that it strongly supported not just the concept of the gangs matrix, but the efficacy of the gangs matrix. You'll remember that it gives a detailed breakdown of the the positive effect that the gangs matrix can have on individuals in terms of their offending and their coming to notice the police before they go on, while they're on, and when they go off the gangs matrix. And it showed very clearly that when people leave the gangs matrix, they do not continue to be targeted by the police, and there is a reduction in that. But we do accept that there are things wrong with the gangs matrix that need to be fixed, and we accept the recommendations of the Mayor's report. We don't take any issue with it. There are some language issues. I mean, I have to be honest in front of you and say there's some language issues. I mean, in terms of how much work needs doing on the matrix in terms of it, because we don't want people to feel that there is a fundamental flaw in the concept, because we don't believe there is. We believe it's appropriate, and the public would expect us to try to pay particular attention to people coming into the orbit of a gang, and to try and, where we can, move people out of that orbit of the gang. And if people are hardened gang members, to focus policing activity on them to try and prevent damage and injury and death to the public. But we accept the recommendations, and we're working very, very hard to put the fixes in place so that the Mayor can look at the gangs matrix and say, yeah, we think it's been rehabilitated in a way that the Mayor's office finds completely acceptable. But I do have to say, I mean, the report was very clear that it's a highly effective tool in dealing with gang violence, and that it does deal appropriately with people going onto the matrix, and it assists people and recognises that people can come off the matrix. The problem with our data handling is that we didn't recognise that sufficiently.
And that's fine, but then let's just spend a little bit of time looking at some of the internal issues, and specifically I'd like to hear your thoughts on there is the three categories, and it's the review raised questions about whether individuals rated as green should remain on the matrix, and I would like some comments from you in terms of that area being prioritised, in that they thought a thorough reappraisal of individuals in this section was necessary, as the level of the risk they present might not justify their inclusion. And that clearly then links with the fact that we saw in that report 5 out of 23 boroughs indicated that they did not keep a record of 2+ sources used to confirm gang membership. So even though the numbers, which appear to me to be incredibly high, over 3,000 are high, it could be that the tool, because it's not, if you like, perfect enough, is not capturing those gang members, men and women of violence, that we need to know about. I mean, what do you say about that? Don't you get a sense of pressing urgency to deal with these issues, because you might well be including people who are not and should not be the focus of your time, and others who should be are out there getting away with murder?
Literally, yes. So maybe I've not put across the fact that, you know, if you take the two reports, the Information Commissioner's report and the Mayor's report, I think it's wrong to view, as maybe some people have, the Information Commissioner as, well, that's just sort of bookkeeping and record keeping. Far from it. The whole point of the Information Commissioner's commentary is that for this to be as effective as possible, it must be accurate.
Yes.
Because if you're recording inaccurate information about the wrong people and keeping people on there wrongly, then A, you are disadvantaging them potentially, but also you're not paying attention to the right people. So the data and the accuracy is absolutely vital, which is why we completely accepted the Information Commissioner's recommendations and are working so hard on them. The vast majority of the recommendations have already been met. and we are continuing to work with the Information Commissioner, as I say, on a weekly basis to make sure that they are happy with and can fully support the gangs matrix as it works. Moving into the Mayor's even more comprehensive report into the gangs matrix, I completely accept that point. Then we need to thoroughly reappraise many aspects of how the gangs matrix is operated. But I also want to say that it was recognised by the Mayor as a highly effective tool in relation to dealing with gang violence and keeping people safe. So it's a case of embracing what is good about it, but identifying that there are many things that need to be fixed about it. We are working very hard on that. So DAC Duncan Ball, who works directly, used to work directly to me in my old role, leads on this on a daily basis and has a team of people working on it to put in place the fixes required to get it up to the spec we want it to be at, which is perfection. It's never going to be perfection, but we want it to be as good as it possibly can be.
And lastly, Sir Stephen, can you give us an assurance that you and your service appreciates the impact that this has, the ripple effect it has within London's African Caribbean communities, certainly within impact with the response that individuals like myself pick up in terms of the question, once again, about confidence in policing when you have a database that's imperfect, that has an 80% African Caribbean content, and where, when you look at the green category, this is the category of people who the review said should not be on there. That was at about 70%, which seemed totally unreasonable and unnecessary to members like myself of London's African Caribbean community.
So yes, last night the Commissioner and I were at a meeting of London Labour MPs. David Lammy was at that and was very vocal and rightly so about the issues of disproportionality. But the disproportionality he was talking about was the hugely disproportionate number of or percentage of black men and sadly black children, as we've seen recently, dying on the streets of London. So is there a disproportionality in those figures in terms of the murders of young black men and boys? Yes, there is. Is that disproportionality reflected within the gangs matrix? Yes, sadly, it has to be accurate. If it was, if it, you know, it sounds counterintuitive, but if it was proportionate, it would be wrong. It has to be disproportionate because there is a disproportionate problem on the streets. The issue then becomes one of, is it in the right percentage point? I think that's something that's quite difficult to take on board. But to specifically answer your question, I can absolutely assure you that from the Commissioner through the whole organisation, there is a realisation and a determination that we keep, regain and build on the confidence we have in all communities in London, but particularly in this instance, the black communities in London, around how we serve them and how we treat them professionally and fairly. And it begins with the data, as you've identified, and it goes all the way through how we implement the gangs matrix. I am personally committed to it, as is Cressida, in terms of making sure that people understand this is used as a tool for the benefit of black communities, not for the disbenefit of black communities.
Thank you. And my last question, Chair, is to the Deputy Mayor. I mean, I raised this issue at full Assembly meeting with the Mayor. This was a mayoral commitment that took, where are we? 2 years into his administration. A report that came out just before Christmas. I welcomed the Christmas break because at least I could get to read it. But you've added another year to actually get the matrix overhauled. And I just don't understand how it's going to need another year when the Mayor came in with a promise to deal with this. The issues were known about from a previous body, We have the IOC report, we've had MOPAC's report. Why is it going to take a year for you to get the matrix up to speed, whilst in that time there are Londoners who will be caught up in that particular section that I talked about, the green section of the matrix, which is very questionable.
So the report, we published it before Christmas. It is, as Deputy Commissioner has already explained, this is the most comprehensive look and review and assessment of the gangs matrix and those individuals who've been on the gangs matrix and come off the gangs matrix. The Evidence and Insight team has rightly taken time to do this. It is a serious piece of work, and that is why it has taken this time. It's over 7,000 individuals have been assessed. And Deputy Commissioner was very humble in saying, you know, some of it you have to be very expert in understanding. They've not just assessed them, they've worked with the University College London to develop a new methodology, which is within the report, to look at how can you really understand the impact of the matrix without a control group, and their new methodology enables that to happen. So that has taken time, and I think that time was right to take. It was right to take that time to get it right and to make sure that we really understood what was happening with the matrix in terms of the delivery of the changes and the Information Commissioner's Office changes as well. We have been working alongside the Metropolitan Police and the Information Commissioner's Office during the course of this review. So it isn't that we publish the report and then work starts to make it, implement the recommendations and make it better. That work has already started, and Deputy Commissioner has already said that many of the recommendations of the ICO's report have been met. The ICO gave the Metropolitan Police 6 months in which to get the house in order. We expect by the end of December 2019 for this to be absolutely done and dusted. That doesn't mean that we're going to wait till December 2019 to make sure that there is progress. And I expect that the vast majority of the recommendations to be implemented much more quickly than that. For example, the information around transparency and accountability and information about how the matrix works and the website, we're expecting that to be up and running by February, and we expect and will keep a track of, and that's also what's important I think about this review and the recommendations, is that scrutiny and transparency and accountability that hasn't been there before on a regular, systematic, consistent basis will be there. But we do expect, it's not that we're waiting to the end of 2019 for this to happen. Can I just say also, I think it's important to link our two discussions around the violence we're seeing on the streets at the moment and this review of the gangs matrix. And I know, just to link it, that actually this is part of the dealing with the really serious violence that we're seeing in London. And it's right, it's right that we have come to the conclusion that this is a legitimate tool, because actually it's dealing with some of the most serious and dangerous and violent gang members in London, and it's right that we have, and the police operational tool that the police have, it's absolutely, and I know you agree, absolutely right that they have this tool, because where we are seeing gang violence in London, it is of the most serious and most violent type, and we owe it to communities, and especially the Black Afro-Caribbean community, to absolutely tackle this, because as the Deputy Commissioner says, and we all know, that disproportionality is with victims as well as offenders, and that is what the gangs matrix is about.
Thank you, Deputy
Mayor.
Mayor.
And Chair, through you, I would ask you that if you could look to reprogramming or getting an update, I should imagine before 6 months, just to ensure that we ourselves are understanding about the programme flow, given the disastrous impact it can have on innocent Londoners' lives. That we must never forget that.
I was going to suggest that. Thank you for those comments.
Equally, I would say this to the colleague, and it needs to be said, it can have a disastrous impact, and that's the bit that I think we're all working to minimise or to get rid of and eradicate. But equally, it can have a dramatic impact both on all communities, black and white, in terms of protecting and saving lives. And I think that's an important point. It can't be just conversed that it would be one-sided. And I do agree with you, it's not being used in the most appropriate way. And, in that sense, we're now trying to put it right. And I do think you're right about urging the speediness to put it right. because we do need to be protected from the most violent people in our communities, and they happen to be in some of the gangs. So I just wanted to say that, and I think that should reflect where we are.
Thank you. Len, your intervention took the words out of my mouth, which I was probably pretty much going to say. And I thank you very much for your summing up at the end, which was not quite the end, but which is important. I think we've got 2 more questions, but we will have to move on. I'm conscious of time, so we'll make this brief as possible. Sean?
Yeah, I've got a few questions relating to timing of things and particularly data protection. If I could say also, if we could review it 6 months from the date of the ICO enforcement notice, because that is their deadline, which was November, so it's only an extra month.
That's not lost on us. We're noting this. If you could proceed. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. I appreciate what you say about these being live issues during the review and some things, and obviously the overlapping ICO investigation, and some things already being in train. One of the things that's mentioned by the Information Commissioner's Office in their enforcement notice is, and they don't have legal powers over this, so they've not issued a recommendation, but they talk about the lack of an equality impact assessment. And in the document, it does say that the timescale for this was given to her by the police as being published in January, 31st of January 2019. Is that still the expected date for us to see the equality impact assessment?
I don't want to be too definitive and give you the wrong answer. My expectation is absolutely right. In fact, I'm not 100% certain it hasn't already been done. Maybe it's waiting to be published. But we are absolutely determined to meet the timescales and, if possible, beat the timescales that the Information Commission has set us. So I can write back to you on that, but I'm pretty sure, well, I'm certain it will be done by then. I'm not sure it hasn't been done already. Okay,
that's really useful, because that would be, I mean, that's something that you'd think would be ongoing during the time. The other thing is, obviously, the deadline given by the Information Commissioner is 6 months from, I think, the 13th of November. And I know that Section 69 of her report says there was some negotiation about this. She actually wanted 3 months from the issuing of the notice. And the police asked for a year. So I was a little bit concerned. Obviously, you've explained slightly, Deputy Mayor, about your year deadline not being, nothing will happen until then. But it's just, when you see December this year in the deadline that's given by MOPAC, that isn't, in a sense, that the deadline for the ICO is expected to slip till then. It's not that, you know, despite what the Information Commissioner has said, she'll have to lump it and wait until December. That is, you're fully committed to meeting all of her recommendations by the 6-month deadline. Sorry, that was a question to you, Deputy Mayor, I'm afraid. Yes, because it's Deputy Mayor who set the new deadline there.
Oh, sorry. It's, I mean, it is not in order to sort of overturn the ICO deadline at all. I mean, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to even if I wanted to. No. It's you know, that's for the ICO, and it's absolutely right. And as the Deputy Commissioner's already said, many of the recommendations have already been you know, met, and we have been working, as have the Metropolitan Police, alongside the ICO as part of this review. So, you know, none of this was a surprise. It is right that the Met takes some time to put this right as quickly as they can, because these are complicated matters, and it's, you know, 32 boroughs, 32. You know, one of the things that the review found was the inconsistency in the governance, as did the ICO, around the governance of the matrix, and that is incredibly. It sounds really dry, but that is really, really incredibly important, and it is right that that's been put right. And I have absolute confidence and no doubt that the Metropolitan Police are absolutely, you know, on this and are implementing it as quickly as they can, and we are going to check that as well.
Yeah, I appreciate it, because one of the findings is there was an awful lot of the data was being shared outside of the Met, and that is a real worry from a data protection point of view. That seems to be the case with the leak that happened as well. I think, and I don't have the exact wording in front of me, that the Mayor at the recent Mayor's Question Time said that every single bit of shared data that was being held by boroughs and other groups outside of the Met has already been retrieved. Is that correct?
I would have to double check that.
Can you confirm
I would have to double check that. What has happened is some of the informal lists that were being held by boroughs has been deleted. So and what is happening is to make sure that there are the right information sharing protocols.
I think technically they're all informal, because there was no data protection agreements drawn up.
So But I would also just like to slightly put it also again into context about data sharing with other partners, because actually the gangs matrix is rightly and has rightly been used as an enforcement tool for those who are, actually committing violence and are members of the gang. And we've always got to remember this is the most serious violence we're talking about. And it's violence on the streets that we are most concerned with at the moment. But that data sharing as well, and it should be done properly, and it should be done within the right protocols and the right data sharing protocols. But that data sharing as well has enabled gang panels within local units and local authorities as well as boroughs to share information and ensure that they've given support and interventions to members of gangs so that they are able to exit that gang lifestyle. And that, so data sharing in itself isn't wrong. It's how it's done, and it's got to be done right. I have seen, and I've been sat in within gangs panels, where that data sharing has enabled mental health provision to be given to gang members.
Yeah, no, I'm not asking about
enabled them to be
the principle, it's the practice.
Yeah, so the practice has to be right, but the principle is absolutely right, especially when we talk about public health, that this is actually also part of a public health approach, that you have the enforcement and rightly, but you also have the intervention
Deputy Mayor,
support.
can I just interrupt? This is most instructive, but I am short of time a bit.
Sorry.
And are you getting towards the end of your question, Sian, please?
One more question
Could
about
you make it, if you make it brief,
another document that
I'll be obliged if you can make it brief, and then bring Susan in, and then we're going to move on, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. The final question is about data protection impact assessment, because that hasn't been done yet. And you would think that alongside the Equalities Impact Assessment, it was one of those things that would come up very early in the liaison with the Information Commissioner. Even, I would have thought, even at the very beginning of the review. So I think, Deputy Mayor, the review began in the middle of 2017. And I would have thought very soon after that, given the alarm that was being raised by members here, by civil liberties groups, that whether it was compliant with data protection law would have been one of the first things you might have looked at, and that might have been flagged. But as far as I can tell, that a data protection impact assessment hadn't been started. There's nothing in, like, unlike with the Equalities Impact Assessment, there's no indication of when that might be published, there's no indication that that's underway. It's one of the requirements of the terms of the enforcement notice.
Could we get this question out,
can I
please?
ask why, thank you, Chair, can I ask why this wasn't kicked off almost immediately? Why it wasn't MOPAC who referred this to the Information Commissioner's Office for review when it was seen that there were potentially laws being broken, and when we're going to get the data protection impact assessment?
So the data protection impact assessment is underway, and as you rightly point out, it is one of the recommendations of the Mayor's of the review that was published before Christmas. In terms of the timing, I mean, the work that was undertaken by MOPAC was looking at a number of different things. Of course, the requirement for data impact assessments came in May 2018. I think when we started, it was not there as a regulatory, GDPR was not yet in force. So this has come about after the start of the review. But it is there. We are absolutely clear that there should be a data protection impact assessment. It's underway and it's going to be completed.
Can I just say, Chair, just for clarity's sake, the DPIA has now been undertaken by the MPS and is currently being reviewed by the Information Commissioner's Office to ensure it's compliant with DPA Part 3. So it's with the Information Commissioner's Office.
And this will be published?
I think it has to be published.
Yes. Thank you.
Susan.
Okay, I'll be really quick. It would appear by the figures that lots of people on this matrix are in custody or subject to judicial restriction are green rated. Are they green rated because they're in custody and therefore of no danger? Because they're in custody?
I don't want to, I think I know the answer, but I'm not sure I'd be entirely accurate. I believe that everybody that is in, believe that the cases are identified on a case-by-case basis, and some people who are in custody are not regarded as green. I don't think it's across the board.
Not all of them because of the figures, but there's a high percentage of them that are green rated. That must be because of the figures that we've got.
Yeah.
My point being is, if they're rated green because they're behind bars or whatever, or subject to judicial restriction, which does seem to stop things, if they're rated as green as that, could it be given a green C or a green something else? Because actually they might be very, very dangerous, but not dangerous at the moment because they're in prison for a while. Yeah. And I think that might be throwing the figures somewhat. Because if you look at a massive percentage that are green, one assumes they're on the matrix, on the periphery, and therefore they're not dangerous. They might be highly dangerous, but in prison, so not dangerous at that moment.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
Could we look at that?
Yeah, I will have that looked at, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that. As a committee, we'll obviously keep track of the Mayor's, the Met's response to the Mayor's report, but I think properly the conclusion that the matrix is a necessary and effective tool to keep Londoners of all communities safe, despite the shortcomings. Right, the next subject, I will ask committee and the panel to keep their answers relatively brief, so because we've got a lot of business to get through. Moped crime. I'll go straight to Andrew.
Well, as you know, this is something I've been on about for some time, bearing in mind that Camden and Islington are the moped crime capital of London. And I'm very pleased to see that there's been a significant impact on getting the numbers down by more than a third in moped-enabled crime and about a third in theft of mopeds. But the numbers are still quite high, so even though it's a significant success, we're still seeing 12,500 offences moped enabled and just over 8,000 moped thefts, so it's still a significant crime. I see that in relation to pursuits, this is where I'm going now, the number of pursuits last year were significantly down compared to the year before, and I wonder why that was. But also we've got this issue of tactical contact where I think we were told there were about 60 last year. And the concern I have about that, I think it's a useful tactic and I don't have any problem with it to that extent, but I understand that the IOPC are looking at 3 cases where this has happened after a tactical contact with one person having a severe injury. So the follow-up question is from that, and put all this in one go I suppose, what support and advice you're giving to officers who are subject to these kind of investigations, and indeed what could potentially the impact be on the willingness of officers to continue this tactic?
So the tactical contact situation is a tactic within policing that is properly licensed, it's trained, only trained officers are permitted to carry out tactical contact. They will only do so in certain circumstances where they feel it is necessary to prevent injury or death, sometimes to the person they're pursuing, more often than not to pedestrians or other road users. As such, officers are, when they're trained and equipped to do it, expected to carry it out when they think it's an appropriate thing to do. So therefore, it's completely expected that the organisation will fully support those officers in the actions that they take. Of course, where that leads to injury to a member of the public, almost certainly the person riding the vehicle that is contacted, then the IOPC are free to look at that and investigate the circumstances. I think we're in a situation where that must be the case, because police actions must be open to scrutiny, and in some cases that scrutiny will be in depth and will take some time. Officers are supported through it. Officers know this is the case. They're well aware of the situation and understand that their actions will be called into account and accept that fact. So we support officers throughout that, and we are confident that officers, if they're properly trained and deploy it in the right circumstances for the right reasons, will be completely supported and exonerated by the IOPC investigation.
So just following on from that, is what you're saying therefore that the risk of officers the risk of officers becoming risk averse because of the IOPC isn't an issue? And secondly, you say it can take some time. What sort of time does it take for the IOPC to investigate these things? And presumably the officers are still on duty, or are they suspended?
Each one of those would depend on the individual circumstance. They certainly wouldn't be suspended from duty unless it was an extremely serious case, and I'm not aware of any of these falling into that category. They wouldn't almost be suspended from driving either. We may discuss with the officer themselves, do you want to continue operating in that role? Bearing in mind you're under investigation for this, you may have to carry out another one. Is that going to in some shape or form prescribe your actions and alter your thinking. I think that would be a sensible thing to do. Do I think it is limiting officers? No, I don't, because we do not force officers to go on the training for tactical contact. Officers volunteer for it. It's seen as a skill. Only our most highly skilled drivers, so you have to be a basic standard driver. You then have to pass the course for that. You then have to take the advanced driving course and pass that. And if you're an advanced driver, you can then volunteer for the tactical contact course, but we wouldn't necessarily take everybody and put them on it. So people know exactly what they're getting into, much like our firearms officers. You know, these people are volunteers. It therefore stands to reason if they're volunteering to have the skill and the ability, then I don't believe they would be constrained. Having said that, quite clearly, they do pay attention to what happens with the IOPC, as do senior management within the Metropolitan Police Service. But we expect the IOPC to carry out a professional investigation and come up with the right recommendations. These tactics are carried out to protect the public. And so long as officers are doing that in good faith and doing it professionally according to their training, then they have nothing to fear. I'm sure the IOPC would say the same. In terms of how long the investigation takes, without being flippant, how long is a piece of string, really? That's not in our gift. We would hope they would be as swift as possible to get the officers clear and get them back performing their full duties as soon as possible.
Can you give us an idea of how long?
Well, it's not days. One would hope it's a matter of weeks, but I fear more often than not it would be a matter of months. It will, of course, depend if there is some sort of court case going on and various complications along those. It's very difficult to give you an exact figure.
And going back to one of my earlier questions or comments, the number of pursuits was down January to November to 480 compared to 651 the previous year.
Yeah.
Is there a reason why we've seen fewer pursuits?
We're not aware of a specific reason why we have seen fewer pursuits. In preparation for this question, I did make contact and ask, are we seeing any lack of willingness? The answer is no. As you pointed out, we have seen a significant reduction in the number of offences because the operations have been successful. So we may well be seeing fewer pursuits as a result of that. It's also quite clear that the recent publicity that the tactical contacts has had an impact on the criminal fraternity. There was a mythology that the police would not pursue, which was never true. There was a mythology if you took off your helmet, if they were wearing one in the first place, and waved your helmet about to show the officer, I'm not wearing a helmet, the officer was obliged to end the pursuit. Again, that's not true. So I think the videos that got all the coverage showing tactical pursuit have made it clear to people, no, this is a tactic, we do use it.
Yeah, well, I think those videos are very helpful for a bit of that myth busting. But,
yeah, so do I.
So I think that's all very important. And I suppose the real answer is, if you don't want to get knocked off, don't have the police pursue you, give in. Yeah.
I just want to emphasise, I know you want to be quick, I must emphasise, officers make a decision to carry out tactical contact, not based on that guy's just stolen that moped. They make the decision to carry out the tactical contact on the basis this person's driving is so dangerous that it has to be brought to a swift conclusion as safely as possible.
Well, they know they're being chased.
Yeah.
Really, really quick. Do they all have a dash cam?
Yes.
And that's always operational when they're doing something like this? Because it's like their yes. body-worn ones. It gives protection to everybody.
Yes, it does. Yes, absolutely.
And they do.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Pete, you have any questions on rising sexual offences?
Good morning, Cecilia. Yes, nearly a year ago now, it was in February, to this committee, when he was asked, your predecessor, Sir Craig Mackay, was asked about sexual offending in London and the rise in sexual offending. And he was asked what it was, what might be behind it, and he said, did he know? And he said, no is the honest answer. I'm quoting it here. It's not simply saying that there is increased confidence, by which I think he means reporting.
Yeah.
He said, there is something going on with sexual offending in London that we don't fully understand the causes of it. We see the end of it, but we don't understand the causes. That was in February last year. I wonder whether you share his mystification.
So I think my predecessor and colleague or ex-colleague Craig Mackey was, as he said, being honest that he wasn't entirely certain, faced with the question as to what it was. There are complications around analysing it. We've had some time to look at it since then. So the most reliable data source on the prevalence of rape in particular is the crime survey in England and Wales, which is carried out not by the police, which indicates that there hasn't been an increase in the volume of rape offences taking place. This is corroborated more locally by anecdotal data from our partner agencies and outreach workers who have not reported any perceived increase in the volume or the number of rape offences. So I guess that takes you down the line. If there hasn't been an increase in the number of offences per se, is it that people are more prepared to come forward and tell us about rape assaults? That remains a possibility, but we do know from the same data that the crime survey of England and Wales that only about 17% of rape assaults are actually reported to the police. Many victims, for a variety of reasons that I am particularly supportive of, have a view that for them personally they don't want to come forward to the police. I would take this opportunity to always ask people to think very carefully about that, and if wherever they feel it possible, they feel that they can come forward and report to the police or to a partner agency who can then help them report to the police, I would urge them to do so, simply because that would allow us to deal with it and bring people to justice and perhaps prevent future rapes. But I understand that it's difficult for people to do that. Which brings you to the issue of, are there other reasons why the numbers have gone up? And we believe that one of the reasons that numbers have gone up is because we've become better at recording them and more accurate in recording rape allegations. And we've seen through analysis that there has been a reduction in the number of rape allegations that we classify as not a crime. We've now been graded by the Magistrate Inspector of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Services as good in terms of our recording of sexual offences. So they've analysed a number of sexual offence incidents. They've looked at how we've dealt with them. They've looked at the number that we've recorded as crime and how we've carried out the investigation, and they've classified us as good in carrying that out. We think that this indicates that we are accurate in our recording of sexual assaults and rape in particular, and that this is probably, and we believe that has improved, so we think that's probably where the increase has come from in the main. In other words, that we are better at recording it.
So I see, so I take from that, sorry, just to make sure I'm clear, that you do think it's about reporting and also about your accuracy in recording.
Yes.
So Craig Mackay wouldn't have known that last year. He was quite... Is that what you're saying? Yeah. I mean, because when he says we are not sure about there's something going on, that is the sort of thing that really makes one very, very worried. What is happening? Are people becoming... What, are they just more... what are they doing? Are there more... For example, on public transport, huge increase in sexual assaults. And I think what worries me particularly when you talk about rape there, is that up until this time last year, 20% nearly rise in rape. Now, we've got this knife crime epidemic going on, but I think you would agree, wouldn't you, that is equally a terrifying statistic, 20% going up. So I take it that you are now saying that's down to your good recording and reporting.
Yes. So what I'm saying is that the crime survey of England and Wales is saying there is no increase in the number of rapes going on. So there is not a sudden upsurge in rape offences. What we're seeing is we are recording it more accurately and we're reflecting a truer picture.
Deputy Mayor, I think at the same time, about this time last year, I asked you about, and you said you were doing research. MOPAC was doing research into what was behind this increase in sexual offending. We asked to see the researchers. We finally did get a meeting a few months after asking them. I think we saw them in September. This is myself and my researcher. Saw them in September. This report has still not appeared. It was meant to come out in the summer, then it was meant to come out in October, then it was maybe November, and it's still not with us. Why the delay?
It will be published by the end of January.
It's what, sorry?
It will be published by the end of January, and you have had the briefing on it. And you know, Steve has already given some of the headlines from that research in terms of what it has found in terms of prevalence, the data, basically what's called crime data integrity reporting, that the police are much better at recording rapes now, and that has been really behind a lot of the increase. But as I said, it will be published end of January.
I see. So that is. I know you can't say maybe in advance, or maybe we already have said it. But
no,
the report is actually going to say that, is it?
It's been done. The report has been done. It's just been sort of verified in the last sort of T's crossed and I's dotted, and a conversation with some of the sector who are most interested in it to make sure that they understand and are happy, and it, you know, sense checking it is happening, and it will be published at the end of January.
I see. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew?
Just a quick one. I think it's probably for Stephen. The figures here are Met figures, and Peter quite rightly raised the issue of offences committed on the transport system, which presumably end up with the BTP. Would these figures include BTP figures, and for that matter, City of London figures, or would they be recorded separately?
So the transport figures will mainly be, will include the underground, but would also include buses.
Yeah, well, buses would be yours, but
exactly.
The underground, the rail network...
Yeah, underground rail would be BTP figures, yes.
So they wouldn't be included here?
They're not included in Met figures, no.
No, and
so they are included in the crime survey for England and Wales.
The national figures, yes, but London figures not. No. And similarly, City of London,
no,
not recorded here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. We spent some time on the subject of violence quite properly. We're moving on now to another important issue, which is sanction detection rates. I mean, in my boroughs, which is Croydon and Sutton, over 6 quarters, they dropped from 17 to 12 and 17 to 9. 17 already, in my view, being a low figure. And we have some questions around that. I think Andrew first.
Yes, and following on from what Chair said, the figures in my 2 boroughs, Camden and Barnet, are also not good. They've dropped dramatically. So why have SDRs continued to fall over the last year? Is the first kick-off question, I think.
This is part of a national trend that we see across the whole of England and Wales, effectively, which is sanction detection rates dropping away. There are a vast number of reasons, I would suggest. Some of that is simply down, I think, to I have to say, down to pressure of work for officers, in terms of we are responding to a significant number of incidents. We're responding to a number of issues around mental health and a variety of other, the whole range of policing. And sanction detection rate often depends on the investigations that we carry out into those offences. If there are pressure of work, that will lead to a reduction in sanction detections. So will other issues. I think, you know, we've seen this trend. It's not just the last year. I mean, this trend has been going on for probably the best part of 10 years, a reduction in detection rates. 10 or 15 years ago, every police force in the UK used to pursue sanction detection rates in a almost with a fervour, and we would send officers to visit prisons and talk to people who've been in prison for offences to see if they wanted to clear up offences, and that would boost the detection rate. We abandoned that because, frankly, it was a ridiculous amount of time spent chasing statistics, and we didn't think it was a good use of time. I think we've seen, ever since then, detection rates coming down, and people will be aware that because of volume of work, volume and the pressure of on officers, we are having to screen out a number of crimes at a fairly early stage. We have to make sure that's a balance which allows us to make the best use of officers without screening out too many crimes that could be detected. What are we doing to try and fix this and try and turn this around? The big issue that we're moving towards is something called My Investigations, which is an entirely different way for the Metropolitan Police Service to carry out investigations. So at the moment, we're sort of halfway through rolling this out, but at the moment in many parts of London, it's a traditional situation where crime takes place, victim reports crime, officer goes, takes the report of the crime, goes away, does a bit of investigation, but then hands it on to more other units, more specialist units, and there are what we call constant handoffs of the investigation. We know for a fact that that is a very inefficient way to carry out an investigation and doesn't meet the victim's needs in any shape or form. So we're moving towards a different system called My Investigation, which effectively means that we will give extra training to all of our response teams and all of our community teams. They will attend the crime and they will take the report of the crime and they will investigate the crime almost from start to finish, unless it's of a particularly serious or specialist nature. The intent here is to drive back up the sanction detection rate by involving officers and getting officers' ownership back into the crime so that they feel personally motivated to deal with the crime. At the moment, many of them are simply recording the event and passing it on to somebody else and don't have sufficient time in their day to carry out the proper investigations. So we're doing work on that. We're also taking a significant step, which is we're deploying detective sergeants, so officers with CRD experience as detectives, but we're putting them onto the response teams so that they are available to responding officers as a resource to help them carry out the investigation and give them advice and support and mentor them through the investigation process, again to drive up the detection rate.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, it may be empirical, but a case I referred to privately to your predecessor last year gave me very little confidence in relation to this, because this was one of these My Investigation cases, very clear, high-definition CCTV of the 4 offenders involved, and the officer to whom it was referred didn't even bother to go and look at the CCTV, and that, to my mind, would have potentially been quite a good way of trying to track down those particular offenders. So, and complaints were made, and eventually a call came through from the sergeant saying, sorry, we screwed up. Now, that is really an example of how I think you've got the theory of how this is supposed to work, but in practice, it does depend on the officers, first of all, having the time to do it. Sure. Secondly, the shift pattern that enables them to do a quick investigation, because if that officer is then off on rotated leave, whatever it is, it becomes potentially impacting on the public confidence of what's going on here. And one of the things I'm particularly concerned about SDR is burglary, which is one of the most intrusive offences you can have, pretty well, apart from serious violence. And the SDR there is very poor. Yeah. Certainly in Barnet and in one of my boroughs. So, I'm just questioning whether, in fact, this is going to work. Okay, so a number of points to raise. I'll be brief. Firstly, before you're going to solve any problem, there's got to be a theory. So the theory certainly comes before the practice and the implementation. So the theory is that this will work. Why do we believe it will work? Well, it works everywhere else in England and Wales. Virtually every other force does this. So we need to look at learning from other forces and adopting what works in other forces. Does the shift, so we then have to get the hearts and minds of the officers. Yeah, you're quite right, that is something that is an ongoing piece of work, but hence doing things like deploying detective sergeants onto the response teams and working with them to give officers unused to doing investigation, and it's not their fault. We simply have not expected them to do this in the past. We're asking them to do something extra and different. So we need to give them help. They need to have training. So we're giving them training in how to carry out the investigations. I apologise for the obvious lack of professionalism in the way that case was dealt with that you referred to. That may be a lack of confidence in the officer or a lack of understanding of what the role was. That will be overcome as we roll out My Investigation and people become more used to it. We've given officers
mobile tablets and laptops to help them do the work and carry out the work away from the police station. In terms of the shift patterns, there are measures in place to make sure that if somebody is away for an extended period of time, then the work is continued in their absence. But there is a balance here to be found in terms of if you keep passing it on to somebody else, it will never get done. So the whole concept is of ownership of the problem, ownership of the solution, and to provide the solution to the member of the public where it's possible.
Obviously, we realise that you're tremendously overstretched with all the cuts that have come from central government, which obviously impacts if you haven't got the officers you need to do the job. So really, I suppose it's a question for Sophie. I mean, do you think that we're able to really crack this without significant more investment and reform from the centre?
I'm glad you've asked that question, because I've been sitting here thinking, everything is right around some of the issues around my investigation, but actually, when it comes down to it, you need the number of police officers to tackle the crimes that are out there, and we've got falling police officer numbers and crime increasing, and it's not just crime increasing, it's the complexity of crime and this sort of different nature of crime as well increasing. So we can do all the right, the Met can do all the right things around the training, different ways of investigating, but the bottom line is you need the police officers there to be there quickly, gain the confidence of the witnesses and the victims, and to get out there and to do the right thing, which I know is absolutely the core of policing, which is to catch the criminals. And that's what sanction detection rates are about. It sounds very dry, but it is about catching the bad guys. And in order to do that, you need the officers.
Which brings me on to the question of detectives, which we know we've had a problem shortage of. How many detectives do we currently have, and how short are we from the establishment?
Oh, I don't have that figure.
Steve. Sorry, I'm afraid I don't have the figure exactly in terms of detectives. I can certainly get it to you pretty quickly. I don't have it at the moment. We are carrying out a number of initiatives to recruit more detectives, so we're looking at trying to bring in more, but we're also looking, so we have a direct entry for detective routes, which is proving remarkably effective, I think, and it's bringing in people who wouldn't necessarily have thought about a police career into the detective role. It's an innovative programme, but it's producing good results so far. It's also producing extremely good results in diversity, in that I think over 50% of the applicants for it are female, which is way in excess of our normal percentage of women applicants. So we're doing different things. Can I just also, it's a slightly different tack, but detection is really important. Catching bad guys is why many of us joined. But prevention is also important. You mentioned burglary. There are a number of initiatives that we could carry out. We're already doing with the support of the Mayor's budget in relation to prevention for burglary, domestic burglary in particular. So the one that I think of immediately is MetTrace, which is proven to be an effective preventative measure for burglary. And we're looking at whether or not we can divert more funding from the Mayor's extra money into MetTrace to try and bring back down again the burglary. The figures suggest MetTrace is effective at preventing burglary.
I think that's helpful, and could I, in that context, big up the PCSO in Edgware, who does a very good job through social media, letting people know where burglaries are and what people should be doing about it. I think she's done a very good job there. But really, what impact is the detective shortage having on SDRs, do you think?
Well, I mean, I would ally myself to the Deputy Mayor's answer. If we had unlimited supplies of detectives, our sanction detection rate would undoubtedly be better. But we do not. We have a limited supply, and we focus them into areas of high harm and high concern. I completely agree with your point that if you take away extreme violence and sexual offences, then burglary is an extremely intrusive crime, and it's something that we are determined to do work on and do more work on. But at the moment, I think I have to be realistic. Our priority is violence. And we are throwing our resources, as we've discussed in the first hour of this meeting, at violence.
Okay. Tony.
Just two things which the Deputy mentioned, which I want to raise before going on to the main part of my thing. You told us that you no longer visit convicted criminals in prison to ask them if there were any other matters they wanted to help you clear up. Is that
routinely,
right?
Not routinely, no.
Has that had any publicity? I mean, that's the first I've heard of it. And if I can recall occasions when we were told that a prolific criminal has been convicted and he's coughed to 100 offences. I exaggerate, but not very much.
Probably not, no.
And that's had a substantial effect on figures which we have had. Does that mean that we should look at previous figures with considerable distrust?
No, I don't think it. No, I genuinely don't think it does mean you should look at them with distrust. So, I mean, let me just be clear: we don't routinely visit criminals in prison to say, "Would you like to quotes cough to close quotes previous crimes that you might have committed?" We don't do that routinely. We do visit some criminals in prison to talk about other things, but that would be more serious crimes, sexual offences, and homicide, etc. Should you mistrust previous figures? No, I don't think that's what I'm saying at all. Those actions were carried out by officers, and people did take the opportunity to, another quote, clear their plate.
But that clearly flattered sanction detections, didn't it?
No, I don't necessarily think it did. I think what it did was raise the detection rate, because people would say, yeah, I carried out that crime. Oh, right, we know who did that. That's a detection. We simply don't do that anymore because we don't want to spend our resources doing it. So we don't get those detections. If we did it again, the detection rate would rise.
Yes.
But it's not something that we think is a good use of police time.
No, all right. I mean, that's something new, but I can certainly recall proudly borough commanders saying to me, we've had this fantastic result. Because, and now that's going, I'm sorry about that. The other thing you talked about was this thing, sort of follow my investigation. I'm afraid I take very much the view that Mr. Dismore has taken on this. It's not so much the police following up my investigation, it's the victim following up his investigation. The victim is told, you bring down the CCTV, you trace this, and so on. And I have certainly written to my borough commander about one of these cases where somebody was caught absolutely bang to rights, and they were told, well, you must follow it through. You know, we're not going to send someone out. It sounds a good thing, you know, nice user-friendly, nice friendly policeman, you know, we've got now a detective sergeant helping people. But if we actually the ratepayers have to do the work themselves, we're not going to be frightfully impressed by that. I'm not sure that I require a comment from you.
There's a question there.
I'm not sure I require a comment from you on that, but I merely say that that's probably very bad PR, because you're going to get a load of people like my constituent who says, you know, he had these people paying the rights and the police did nothing about it. The most significant...
Can I say, I don't agree with your description of I mean, if that's your experience, I apologise for it, but that's not my expectation of my investigation. It certainly isn't the Commissioner's, and it's not the vast bulk of the Metropolitan Police's intent around how we carry out my investigation. It is the professional way to do it. It is the modern way to do it. It's the way many other police forces do it with great success.
The most important thing that I want to deal with on sanction detections, and this refers to the Deputy Mayor, before we set up the new borough command units, the leaders of two of my boroughs wrote into MOPAC at the time of the consultation, this is in Richmond and Kingston, wrote in saying they weren't very keen on Richmond and Kingston being thrown in with Wandsworth, if I can put it that way, thrown in with Wandsworth, because they feared all the resources will go to Wandsworth and crime will be worse in Richmond and Kingston. I have to say that looking at the MOPAC figures, those two leaders were absolutely right. What has happened is there has been a catastrophic fall in sanction detections in Richmond and Kingston. There's been a fall in Wandsworth as well, but the fall has been very much less. And this is being interpreted, certainly by me, and I suspect any body who looks at the raw figures which MOPAC have published will say that this is what has happened. The resources of, if I can put it this way, hitherto the safest boroughs in London have been robbed to help the situation in Wandsworth. And I think if you look at the figures right across the piece, and I think again Mr. Dismore was making at this point, that not all of the boroughs in the new merged command units have had the same results. It does look, if you look at it geographically, the boroughs which are furthest out have had a bigger decline in sanction detections than the boroughs which are closer to the centre. I wonder if you care to make an observation on that, Deputy Mayor.
I'd have to go back and look at the figures around that. So is it outer London boroughs that have are seeing the highest fall in sanction detection rates? Because certainly, from my memory, that's not the case in some of the boroughs where sanction detection rate for particular crimes have very much fallen in inner London. But there's no getting away from the fact that sanction detection rates at the moment are too low. And the Deputy Commissioner and the Commissioner are really clear about that. But I meet regularly with Martin Hewitt and Mark Simmons to look at the borough mergers and the indicators around the borough mergers. And the sanction detection rates, they don't clearly correlate with when the merger comes in or doesn't come in. It is not totally consistent around London, so that it isn't a sort of correlation between borough merger then sanction detection rates go down. There is a different and inconsistent pattern across London, and that's what we are looking at, and to really understand about why is it that in some areas my investigation is working extremely well, in other areas it seems to be not working so well, and sanction detection rates are not where you would want them to be.
Well, the truth of the matter is, of course, we haven't had sufficient figures. The only thing that I can say to you is this: if you look at the figures in the last MOPAC report, quarterly report for South West, which is my patch, the thing that the borough leaders warned about has actually come to pass. And their view is, and my view as a constituency member is this: my constituents pay council tax in the same way as the people in Wandsworth pay council tax, and every other Londoner is paying this. But we're getting the rough end of the stick on this one. And
I do look at the figures regularly with the Deputy Assistant Commissioner, but I would actually, I would question the logic between sanction detection rates being not where they should and falling, and that means therefore that the resources have been sucked to somewhere else. There are different matters at play here. There's different issues around culture, around training and around my investigation that are being dealt with at the moment. In terms of resources, and it's cold comfort, but actually resources have always followed the highest demand and the highest need, and the resources in a basic command unit will always be allocated in that way. That is nothing new. That's not new to the borough mergers.
Well, that's one way of interpreting it. I've interpreted it in the way that I think my residents who simply look at the bald figures which MOPAC have published and will say the poor residents of Kingston and of Richmond are being punished because of the change. If I can move on to something else again which relates to sanction detection and the recording of crime. Do you not think, and this really is one for the Deputy, that if you're going to screen out a large number of crimes, and I refer particularly to theft from shops, where police say that they're not going to investigate theft from shops of less than £200, there is going to be a decline in the number of such offences recorded because shops are going to say, well, this is a complete waste of time, and this is likely, therefore, to be shown up in the statistics as a fall in the incidence of these crimes. But in fact, the number hasn't actually fallen. The truth of the matter is, and that people say it is a waste of time reporting this kind of crime. If I can say anecdotally, I'm a cyclist. I cycle to the station every morning, and I speak to other cyclists who are very brave. We lock up our bikes at the station in the mornings. And it's a frequent experience that bicycles are stolen from stations. I appreciate it's BTP, but they say they're not going to report it because they know that nothing will happen. And can I suggest to you, Mr. Howes, Sir Stephen, that people are not from shops going to report shoplifting because they know it's a complete waste of their time?
Well, first thing I'd say, without trying to avoid the question, is if your pedal cycle's stolen, you should report it. It's wrong to suggest that we wouldn't investigate and wouldn't recover, because we do. But moving on, and the same I mentioned would be true for the BTP. On theft from shops, I wouldn't want to speculate There is a logic to what you say, but equally there may well be a situation where people who are in the industry may feel that they should report because they want a record of the fact that they've had a theft from the shop. That might be something they want to do. There is a financial limit. We do that again because of resources, but we would also look in the screening in or screening out of what are the chances of detection. So again, if shops have the CCTV, if we can get access to it quickly, if we think it's a repeat offender, if we think that there is something we might want them for other than the shop theft, then we may well deal with it. But in many instances, you're quite correct. Under that value, we would end up screening that out. So we don't have the resources to investigate all these.
This, of course, is going to lead to complete scepticism about the publication of statistics, where we say certain crimes are rising, certain crimes are falling, because of the attitude that the public has to whether or not police will detect it. I understand that your latest figures, which are coming out before the next MOPAC quarterly report, actually bears out exactly what I have said, that there is a decline in the number of crimes being reported as being theft from shops, which really kind of goes against common sense. That this is happening, and the real reason for that is the crime is taking place, but shopkeepers say, well, you know, this is really rather pointless. Kind of goes back to my initial point about people having to investigate their own crimes. And they say, oh, well, we won't bother reporting it because the police aren't going to do anything. It's all very well for you to say, Deputy, that you want the public to report crimes, but you know, we're all very busy people, you know.
Well, that's correct, but that's why we're making it easier to report crime. So you can report a wide range of crimes online now, or you can certainly do it by phone. And many of our statistics that we keep on the phone reporting of crime shows us that actually the public satisfaction level with that, when they get the right service in terms of an immediate response, are very happy with that. So we are actually trying to open ourselves up to people to report more crime. And I wouldn't want to take the generalisation comment that you've made about all crime based solely on shop theft. So I don't think that applies across all categories of crime, far from it.
I wonder if what you have just said is correct, saying that the public are quite satisfied when they report crime. We've had these reports on 101 and people simply hang up.
Right, so that's, again, if you look at the more recent figures, you'll see that the 101 figures have improved significantly. So the last week that I'm aware of, the waiting time on 101 was 40 seconds. Now, that may sound like a long time in comparison to 999, where the figure is around about under 10 seconds. It's a fair wait. But I think the public understand that these things are prioritised. We are opening the organisation up, and actually the easiest way to report is online, not phoning up. But if
so Steve, I'm going to intercede because we are probably going to return to the...
I've aired the matter, Chair.
No, and well aired too, but we will probably return to the reporting issue on a separate time as a subject in and of itself, because I know from experience that the online reporting isn't necessarily working that well. But we're going to return to it fully.
One last thing, because I just sitting here feeling a little bit impatient about your, the questioning, because what lies at the heart of some of the problems that you're talking about is officer numbers, and that comes down to funding. And you talk about, the residents of Richmond and Kingston being punished. The residents of London are being punished by the government that you're a member of the party of.
That's naughty, that is naughty, numbers. Deputy Mayor.
If we could, we would put more officers in.
No.
I think that was the exchange was a fair exchange. Caroline.
Yes, let's get back to sanction detection rates. All UK police forces were ordered, I think, 3 years ago to ensure their labs met international forensic standards, and the Met failed to gain accreditation at the time. The UK forensic science regulators warned this could cause cases to collapse, and the MPCC lead for forensics has described delays to gaining accreditation as a critical incident. Are you concerned that this problem with forensics in London could be having an impact on sanction detection rates?
So I think the Met is in a far stronger position than many other forces find themselves in relation to forensics. There's always been a big investment within the Met into forensics. I again, I'm sorry, I wasn't aware of this topic moving into the forensics side. If I had been, I'd have come with a bit more information on it. But I speak regularly to Chris Porter, the Director of Forensics for the Met. He is very confident around the accreditation and believes we're in a very strong position on accreditation by the independent body. So I don't think that's our specific problem. I think, without repeating the Deputy Mayor's words, there is an issue of investment and sheer volume of what goes through our forensics officers' hands, particularly the crime scene investigators and then the scientists that work at Lambeth and elsewhere. I think there's a volume issue and there's a complexity issue around the number of cases they're having to deal with. Disclosure comes into that with increasing complexity around what the disclosure requirements are. But I think in comparison to many other parts of the UK, our forensics is well funded and will be looked on favourably by the accreditation. And
when's it due then to be accredited?
The reason I'm nervous is I thought it was around about now, and I think it may already have happened.
Can you remind me, is it in-house still or is it external?
What, the accreditation?
The forensics service.
The forensics is part of the Met.
It isn't, but you haven't got. Do you use a company as well?
Sorry, yeah, there's quite a complex forensics market in England and Wales now. With the end of the Forensic Science Service a number of years ago, it went private. The Met opted, and it's been proven to be entirely correct, not to go down the fully privatised route. So we kept our own facilities, which was just as well, because a number of the private providers have gone bankrupt, and it's still a very, very difficult market. We do use some. We use some extensively, but we use the bigger ones. But we've got quite a lot. I mean, our forensics department has 1,000 people.
Okay, but you don't think that's not having an impact on the fact that you weren't accredited? You don't
no,
think it's having an impact on sanction detection?
I think we're in a good position. No, I don't believe so at all.
Okay.
No.
And then my other question is, last week one of London's 2 chief Crown prosecutors said he feared officers were too busy to investigate racist crimes adequately or to do the necessary paperwork to enable the hate aspect of an offence to be included in a charge. What's your response to that?
Response is knowing the individual and knowing that I didn't manage to get to speak to him personally, but he did discuss it with some of my colleagues. I'm not entirely certain he was happy with the article, but you'd have to speak to him about that. In terms of if that's what he said, and I don't believe it was exactly what he said. No, I don't agree with him.
So you don't think that's happening at all?
And I don't believe that the CPS press release that came out as a response to what he said agreed with him either.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just to summarise a couple of points. I mean, certainly I'd echo Andrew Dismore's point around burglary. Burglary has a disproportionate effect on neighbourhoods, and I think that's important that we need to look at that.
Can I just say, Chair, our burglary detection rate is better than our most similar forces, and much of that is driven by forensics.
Yeah, okay, I've heard that before over many years of looking at policing, and it still doesn't give me any comfort. And secondly, just to be contrary to Tony's point, all 3 of my boroughs, Bromley, I'll adopt Bromley because it's part of my BOCU, Bromley, Croydon and Sutton, are all consistently sanction detections going the wrong direction. Now, we're entering what I call my last half hour, and we have 2 questions. Mental health and policing. I think that's Caroline.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Deputy Commissioner, the HMI recently recommended all forces should assess their mental health related demand. How clear are you on the demands placed on your officers related to mental health?
I'm very clear that they are significant demands. I've got quite a lot of material here on it. Some of the figures. So our mental health flagged calls, the calls that come into our command and control now flagged as mental health, have increased by 33% in the last 5 years and are running at 115,000 annually. So quick maths, that's over 2,000 a week. I guess it's, so that on that basis it's 300 a day. Our mental health, we get a mental health call every 4 minutes. And we don't deploy to all of them, but we do deploy, we think, on average to a mental health call once every 12 minutes. If you speak, and I'm sure you do this, speak anecdotally to officers, I would be surprised if they don't say to you that it forms a significant and very complex part of their working day, responding to mental health calls. I think we feel as a service that, and the HMIC report very clearly said, the police service nationally is picking up work in relation to mental health that it should not be asked to do, that we are not equipped or trained to do, Having said that, you will equally be aware we are undergoing a huge amount of training to get our officers more aware of mental health issues so they can deal with it more professionally and more effectively. Just yesterday we had 3 officers assaulted at a mental health facility where they went along to help staff in relation to a mental health self-assessment, and 2 officers were stabbed and 1 officer suffered a shoulder injury. Luckily all 3 have been released from hospital just now, but one can imagine the consequences. So it's a very real issue for our officers and a real issue for us. We are working hard, and we've got some very dedicated staff rolling out training. So the training takes place, I think you'll know this, at Hendon for our new recruits. It's not enough. We know it's not enough, but there are plans to increase that, and there's also plans to have a day's training for all officers on BCUs as well, to give them a greater awareness of how mental health subjects will present themselves and the variety of ways they can present themselves, how we can respond and should respond, what partners we should be using, and also put them into some scenarios where they can practice some of these skills before they actually have to use them on the street.
Well, that's really useful to hear, because you predicted my next question, which was going to be on training, and that did come out in our session last month. We heard from experts that some of the best training comes from people who've lived experience of mental health needs, and also they can help develop the training. So this new one-day training package you're planning for all officers in the front line in the BCUs, is it going to have that direct input, and is it going to be proper face-to-face training, which also I think HMI recommended? So
as I indicated, it's certainly going to have training that is based on scenarios, and so officers will be put into a position where they have to practice the skills. It will certainly be done with partners. I can't say for certainty that it will be done with people who have suffered from mental health. I would be surprised, frankly, if partners don't come forward with those people. I think the Deputy Mayor's knowledge is better than mine in this area, so it sounds as though that will be the case. I mean, I've certainly read the record of your discussions with Andy Trotter and the other experts in that area, and I noticed that many of their comments focus, and I've sort of underlined their quotes, are that yes, the Met's not exactly where we want to be, but it's streets ahead of where it was a few years ago, and that's leadership all the way from the top of the organisation, not when I was here, but predecessors, all the way down to responding officers. There is a completely different attitude and appreciation of our role in relation to mental health, and our acceptance that if other agencies aren't able to do it, and I'm not criticising them, they're just not simply equipped to do it, then we will have to. I also notice how many Section 136 referrals take place outside of office hours, and therefore fall almost predominantly onto police officers, although we have taken, as you'll know, huge steps to stop taking 136 patients into police custody, and the numbers have fallen dramatically. And I think that that statistic alone underlines the fact how much more sensitive we are to these issues.
Deputy Mayor, Lord Adebowale called really for the Met to be more publicly accountable for its work on improving its response to people with mental health needs. Are you looking at how, and are you measuring and reporting on public satisfaction regarding the police where mental health is involved? Is this an area you're looking at?
Just quickly, in terms of the lived experience, they are going to be, as part of that training, they're going to be using videos of people who have lived experience of mental health issues as part of that training. So yes, that is absolutely something within that. In terms of what we look at and scrutinise in terms of mental health, in terms of satisfaction, when you dig down into the figures, we do look at disabilities, and we do also look at have people's vulnerabilities being identified. So it is part of the scrutiny. I'd have to come back to you in specifically about whether it really picks up on whether it's mental health as a vulnerability, and how much we have within that, but it's absolutely part of that scrutiny around victim satisfaction as well as public satisfaction.
So if you're not picking that up, obviously you're going to come back to us, will you look at how you might?
Definitely.
And how are you monitoring any equalities issues in relation to mental health and policing?
Well, the part of the equalities, we monitor equalities across the board in terms of, and the Commissioner chairs the Stride Board. I haven't got figures in front of me in terms of mental health. I'll have to come back to you on that actual monitoring of it, but it is part of the equalities monitoring.
Okay. And then obviously the Mayor has a role here, and in the police and crime plan there are a number of measures relating to policing and mental health. By the end of this mayoral term, what progress do you expect to have been made around the plan's commitments in this area?
So the major commitment within the police and crime plan was around mental health units within each basic command unit, and that will have been rolled out by the end of the rollout of the borough mergers, and that is an increase of officers per borough, and it's an actual proper increase per borough, because I think it's 1 per borough last time before, and it will be 2 per borough now. So that, you know, it will be, that will have been delivered by February when the final rollout of the mergers takes place.
Okay, and then there are a number of others. I mean, improving measures to divert victims, accessing appropriate services, increasing health commissioning.
Yeah, and that's part of that is the look at custody that the Metropolitan Police has had in-depth analysis around custody, not just around actual physical custody, but also what happens in healthcare and custody, which I know you've taken a very long-term and serious interest in. But that's also why the Mayor has put the extra money into the Metropolitan Police specifically around mental health. It's 2.3 million this year, 3 million ongoing after that, and that is to ensure, and part of that is about training of officers. Next year will be a rollout of, we're still looking at proposals on this, but there'll be a rollout and possibly rollout around on-street triage, mental health nurses and clinicians, and also the actual training within some of the small the response services around mental health. So that's being funded and invested and beginning to roll out.
Okay. Perhaps when you write to us after this, we might get by the end of the mayoral term where you hope all these areas to be. That would be great. And finally, obviously the mental health investigation teams, how are they helping frontline officers deal with mental health demand?
Sorry, is that for...
Either of you, I don't mind. Maybe it should be to you, Deputy Commissioner.
I've got to be honest. I'm not in a position to answer that one straight away. I don't have the information or the personal knowledge about that. I'd have to come back to you on it.
Right, to us.
Do you know? Okay, I'll have that in writing then. Thank you.
Okay. Andrew.
I'd like to ask you about a slightly different aspect of mental health, and that's mental health support for officers who've dealt with traumatic issues. I've just been on observing a urban search and rescue exercise with the fire brigade, and actually coincidentally that's quite a good example of blue light collaboration, because we had both the police dogs there and the disaster victim identification team, and as one does, we start to talk to the officers, and I was very concerned about what seemed to me to be quite a lack of mental health support for people who are doing that very traumatic job. And certainly compared to the fire service, the police seem to be a long way behind the game in what's on offer. And I wondered if you could give us a bit of an indication about what's going on there.
Well, I'm disappointed. I'm actually a bit amazed to hear what you say, because we have in place quite comprehensive programme of support and counselling for officers involved in, particularly people on the DVI teams who would be subject to particular stresses and strains over an extended period of time. There's built-in counselling, psychological counselling for those people. So I'm a bit mystified by that, to be honest. On a general level, officers who are involved in a traumatic incident will always be offered some sort of counselling. It may not always be face-to-face. It may have to be through over the phone, which is not ideal, but then we have providers and we have to have a contract with the providers, and again we're down to resources. But we get reports every day, 24-hour period of the significant incidents and crimes that take place across London. And I can tell you without any shadow of a doubt, the 3 officers I mentioned who were injured in the mental health incident yesterday have all been seen by senior officers, have all had welfare visits from those officers, and we make sure that their health is fine, and that includes their mental health. And if they present or ask for any assistance in relation to the trauma they've been through, then that will be given to them.
Well, that's certainly the impression I got from officers who've been at the Croydon tram crash, involved in Grenfell Tower. They're saying there was no follow-up. when they asked, it was a 6-month wait for counselling support.
Okay.
I mean, that really, to my mind, if it is the case, is not acceptable.
No, it's not acceptable at all.
Compared to what happened with the firefighters at Grenfell, they were offered immediate help.
Yeah.
I mean, it may well be an issue, Chair, that we'd want to come back to look in a bit more detail,
Yeah.
so rather than take up the time now.
I think we'll return to that another time. Right, we're on our last question of the morning, of the afternoon now, I'm sorry, which is diversity in the Met. I think, Sian, you are initially leading on that, aren't you?
Thank you. Obviously, the Commission has been looking at diversity over many, many years and keeping tabs on progress. And we've pulled out a snapshot of data to see what progress is being made, and it goes back 2 years, back to quarter 2, 16-17, comparing that with quarter 2, 18-19. So we're looking at the proportion of female officers increasing in that time by 1 percentage point, so that's gone from 26% to 27%. And then BAME officers has gone up also 1 percentage point, from 13% to 14%. This seems very, very slow progress. I've done some initial sort of calculations, and we are looking at basically 2070 before we get to proportionality in either of those measures. So can I ask, how do you assess that progress? Do you think it's good enough? And how is measures that you've got in place to improve diversity, how are they working out and how are they being potentially stepped up?
So the figures that I'm looking at right now, which are from our Stride aspirations, and are pretty current, are saying that at the moment our workforce is, for police officers, is 27%. That compares...
Not female officers.
Sorry, did I not? Yeah. Female officers is 27%. Compares not as well with West Midlands, which is 31%. Basically, our most similar forces are a couple of percentage points ahead of us, and I know that Police Scotland was mid-30s, mid-30%. It's not as good as we would want it to be. Our aspiration, as you've indicated, is it reflects the population of London, so it's going to be 51%, I think, if that's the case. And as far as I'm concerned personally, and I know the Commissioner, that's what we're aiming for. You're quite right, though, at the rate of knots we're going, it's going to be many decades before we get there. So we had a session in our last Management Board Away Day talking about what else can we do in relation to this, and there are a number of action plans that Claire Davis is taking forward in relation to our recruiting and our progression and our retention. Much of it does focus around retention, I have to say. We've identified that one of our biggest hotspots where we don't do well is returning mothers. Interestingly, not the first child, but the second time is where we really lose officers returning. Being a father of 3, I have some vague understanding of why that would be. It's just one you can get back, and the second one is it just becomes too much of a juggling act, I guess. Why is it a juggling act? Because we are not as flexible as we should be in terms of the shift patterns that we offer. So we've taken the decision that, and this is not a revelation, but that our view is that the standard should be that we will offer you flexible shift patterns or flexible working, and it's up to the organisation to prove why that should not be the case, as opposed to up to the applicant to say, I want flexible working. Well, can we do that? So the default position is available, and we move back from that to say, well, actually there are some roles where it's not available for a variety of operational reasons. The expectation should be, for the vast majority, flexible working should be entirely possible. But one of the things that we get from our focus groups is actually the problem about coming back is coming back. It's too much of a step. It's too daunting. So we don't keep in touch sufficiently well with officers, not formally. We don't keep in touch formally with officers who are off on maternity leave. So they're away for months, and then when they come back, or try to come back, they find that their supervisor's changed. Half of their team's changed and moved on. Actually, we've moved to a different operating base, and we're doing a slightly different job. there's new legislation come in, and by the way, there's some new technology as well that you have to use. And it was all very daunting. So the feedback from female officers is you've got to put effort into keeping in touch. So bring us in for a day or half a day, upskill us, tell us what's changed, let us meet new people, as opposed to we're off for 6 months, we then come back and everything's changed. And it's too much and people simply find it too daunting. So things like that. As you'll know, the biggest change in recruiting we've carried out recently is we've moved away from the London-only requirement. It's too early, I think, yet to say what impact that will have. My personal view is it shouldn't have much of an impact in terms of gender diversity. We are seeing a significantly increased number of applicants because of it. We got yet to get people through the door to see how does that translate into people coming into the organisation.
As I understood it, that measure, as along with preferencing candidates with extra languages, was more or less specifically designed to make sure that it was more representative of Londoners. I mean, partly to make sure it was more Londoners,
yes,
but also because that London is significantly more ethnically diverse, yes, than the surrounding counties.
Yes.
Won't relaxing that requirement make it worse?
Yes. So we've been talking about gender up to now. So if we look at black and minority ethnic candidates, I think that's. I have to be honest. I think that will happen. We will see a reduction in the number of black and minority ethnic candidates coming forward.
As a result of that change?
As a result of that change.
Yeah.
Now, we are putting in place some specific recruitment initiatives and putting money behind those initiatives to target specific audiences and areas to try and counteract that deficit. But I think it's realistic to expect that it will happen. The reason why, of course, is because we've had to look to see what our recruitment levels are like, and we simply were not able to attract enough people within London to get to the volume of the ambition for the number of officers that we want to have. And there was a very, very difficult decision, which frankly was being discussed the day I arrived back in March, and we only took the decision, I guess, 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, something like that, to actually change it, because there was agonising around what will this do to the mix of our recruits. But eventually we felt that we were simply not making progress in increasing our numbers, and that was impacting the service we could offer the public. So we had to do something about it. I don't believe it's something that we're looking at as a permanent change. I think it's a matter we check legally, can we lift it, put it back in again, and the view was yes, you can.
And have you made any change to the language requirement?
Sorry,
the language preference thing as a result as well? Are you not?
I don't believe that is in place either now, no.
Okay.
I'm not sure that's been in place I think that went a while ago, if I'm honest.
Okay.
I don't know, but it's not something that I'm aware of. I think
okay, I might ask for some written clarification of when that came in and out. That's okay. Yeah, we've talked with the mayor actually about the difficulties in increasing the net number of officers because of the number leaving. So the amount recruiting actually has to be hundreds and hundreds every month. Is that right? Do you have a target for how many you're recruiting?
Yes. So on an average, to stand still, numbers wise, we have to recruit something like 1,400 officers per month. Yeah. To recruit 1,400 officers, we have to have close to 14,000 applicants, because we take about 1 in 9, 1 in 10 of people who apply. So to grow, you have to go beyond that figure. So it sounds like small numbers initially, but actually when you start doing the maths, it becomes really quite significant numbers that you have to attract to apply. And the view eventually became, not from police officers, but from recruitment experts, that actually, for the ambition to grow, you're going to have to go outside the London perimeter.
Okay, so finally, I mean, obviously the problem we've got with the BAME diversity, particularly within the Met, is really acute and it is a very strong commitment of the Mayor, actually, to improve on that. So if we're doing measures and some of the changes that you're doing to get the numbers up, we're actually going to make that worse. Is there a case for taking more drastic action? I refer particularly to affirmative action, relaxing the equality requirements for a period of time to help even things up. The majority of the committee supported the view that this might be necessary in the future a few years ago. And
it was a previous committee, I hasten to indicate.
Sorry, I said a few years ago, and it was a majority view. It was quite clear. And so we've discussed this with the previous commissioner, who had, from his experience in Northern Ireland of balancing the police force there, some experience of this working, and was reasonably positive about this potentially being a tool. The new commissioner we've discussed it with, and she's not so keen, but she's made it clear this is a personal view, and I'm asking about personal views now. Can I ask what your personal view of affirmative action, positive action to improve diversity in a sort of crisis situation would be?
So our black and minority ethnic figures are 14%, which, given the London context, is very poor. It's significantly better than the similar forces, but then you've got to look at the population. So it needs to be far higher than it is. And we've taken steps, as you're well aware, with PCSOs. It's a far higher percentage, and that is one of the arguments around increasing the number of PCSOs, because they then become a visible face of uniform Met policing, but also feed through to significantly through to uniformed police officers as well, which would be an extra route in. Affirmative action, I guess I would have my reservations about it. I mean, it was done in the Northern Ireland context around specific time and place. I actually don't know what the figures look like now in PSNI. I know what the requirement was back then. I know it's been done abroad. It's been done in New York. I think it caused... I think it created the numbers in New York. I think it had other less desirable knock-on effects there. I fear that might be the situation. I would probably go along with the Commissioner. I would have some reservations about it.
Okay, thank you.
But I do think we need to do far more than we're currently doing, and there is a determination to do that. As I say, we know lifting the London requirement is going to have a problem, but we are putting money into specific advertising to try and counterbalance that bad effect.
I would also say that I think you should also look at the figures for the recruitment, the people that are coming in now, and what the percentage of women is and the percentage of black and minority ethnic new recruits are. Because yes, it is frustrating, because it does take a lot of time, because you're starting from a lower base. You've got 30 years of not very diverse Metropolitan Police service that you're trying to change, and you can only change it through new recruits. So actually, when you look at the percentage of the recruits coming in, it's not good enough, but it's much, much better than the sort of 14, 15% and 26, 27%. And the work that the Metropolitan Police has done in terms of the recruitment and taking out some of the recruitment process, taking out some of the issues that were causing people to drop out, has been really effective. So yes, look at the overall figures, but actually look at the recruitment tranches that are coming through now, which has really improved diversity. Not good enough, but much improved.
So in 2017, black and minority recruitment was 28%. That was in 2017. In 2016, it was 25%. So it's been going up towards 30% for black and minority ethnics. Actually,
up to sort of double the actual overall rate.
Yes, because it's such a big organisation, it takes a long time to shift the base figure. So the recruitment has been far higher. And I should have explained that. I apologise for that. But interestingly, we haven't seen the same increases in women. So in 14-15, the recruitment was 28%, and 16-17, it was 30%. It hasn't gone up as high, and we've looked at reasons why that might be. Some of it is, as I say, is around, it's not looked on as a family-friendly organisation. I think wrongly. I think we try to be, and we're trying to take steps to do that. But I think that's one of the key issues for us.
Is that recruitment data reported on a regular basis? I know the figures, the overall figures, are in the quarterly.
Yeah, I think it's available. I think, yeah.
Okay.
And I've asked some mayor's questions about, for example, just cohorts like the direct entry detectives. I looked at the diversity of that, and that was, I think, significantly better for women as well. So.
Over 50, I think just over 50% for women.
Yeah.
In direct entry recruit for detectives. Yes.
Thank you, Peter. Hopefully, the last question today is going to be an uplifting question for you, Peter.
A tiny one, actually. It's just on the off chance. We've been talking about the police force in London. Do you happen to know, Sir Stephen, or where can I find out how many of your force live outside Greater London? I mean, of the whole lot. Because this whole thing, increasingly with hospital workers and everything, having to live outside because they can't afford to be in here.
50%.
The Deputy Mayor is saying 50%. She's got a
Really?
better brief than
Is
I
that
have
much,
on
is it?
I don't know idea.
Right.
I don't know.
About that regularly.
Got that information, Peter, around
Okay, thank you.
around the
Thank you
table.
for up to date, yes.
Okay. Thank you. And it's not the last question. The Deputy Chair's privilege to have the last question.
Thank you, Chair. I'm conscious of the time, but I do have to raise this issue. So, Deputy Commissioner, I applaud all the efforts you're doing to improve diversity in the Met. You talked about a significant number of applications coming in, but you also talked about the problem of retention, and clearly there's no point in recruiting people if you lose them. So I want to specifically ask you about the question of women and the police service. A Guardian investigation last week found that hundreds of women working in the police across the whole of the UK face sexual harassment committed by their colleagues. Do you think that this problem is present in the Met?
I think undoubtedly the problem will be present in the Met because we're an organisation of 40,000 people, and you know, and many thousands of those are women, both officers and staff. So yes, I believe it will be, but I also believe there's a clear determination in the leadership to deal with it. I believe there's a clear confidence in the women in the workforce to come forward and tell us about it. There are a huge number of initiatives led by a female commissioner to say this is not acceptable in the organisation, and we will deal with it and we will try to stamp it out.
Yeah. So I welcome your honesty, and you answered my question. But to improve this, so I submitted a written question to the mayor late last year, and I received a reply just the Monday gone, which said that this is about, my question was how many female police officers in the MPS have reported being sexually harassed by colleagues over the last 5 years. The answer was a very bland answer. Every allegation of this kind is taken seriously by the MPS, with each complaint investigated fully. However, due to the way that these allegations are currently collated, there is no reasonable way that this level of information can be extracted practicably. So don't you think that having systems in place where this information can be collated, that you can understand the scale of the problem? And I'll tell you why I ask you this. Again, going back to the Guardian article last week, other police forces managed to keep such data. So the Guardian reported 450 complaints across the UK, but it said the complaints were likely to be even higher, as only 28 out of 43 police forces provided the data, with many, including the Met, claiming they were unable to supply information or had failed to respond within time limits. What are the problems in keeping such data? I mean, other organizations managed to do that, and other police forces. I don't want to put you on the spot, but we need to look into this because clearly,
I will look into it and I'll come back to you, but I also read the article and I noticed that actually the figures quoted are over a significant time period as well. That's not an annual figure.
And finally, finally, Chair, concern, again this is an article, concern was raised about the system in place to deal with harassment, and it was comparison with other public sector organizations, which I won't go into. So what systems do you have in a nutshell? I know it's a complicated process, HR and all that, but I mean, you must have recorded sort of systems and so on.
So we have internal processes around grievance, but quite frankly, I wouldn't expect a female officer or indeed a male officer, if they're a subject of sexual harassment, to use the grievance procedure. I'd expect them to come forward to their line manager or to their staff association or to some peer group or to a support group, and there are many of all of those, to say, I'm being sexually harassed, and frankly, if it meets the crime level, then it would be investigated as a crime. There's absolutely no reason why the figures shouldn't be available, and there is no reticence within the organisation to confront this issue and deal with it. But I'll tell you why, is because I actually believe we have a workforce made up in the main of highly professional and competent people who don't do this sort of thing. And I believe one of the huge advantages of increasing women in the organisation is, frankly, it confronts this and it stops it, because it gives force to the women to say, this is not acceptable. Sure. And actually, the best way of dealing with it, we need to deal with each one if it's a crime and make sure there's an appropriate measure. But the best way of dealing with it is at the lowest level, before it ever starts, make it quite obvious to male offenders that they cannot get away with this behaviour in this organisation. It's not acceptable to the senior leaders, and it is not acceptable to your peer group.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. That's the end of the questions. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much, both of you, for your answers this morning and attending today. Can colleagues note the monthly report from MOPAC? Can we, item 7, can I ask the committee to note the progress and work programme, delegate authority to me with consultation for site visits, which we discussed earlier. Date of next meeting is Wednesday the 23rd of January. Item 9, I have no urgent business. Thank you, colleagues, for this morning.
Thank you.
GLA Chamber Sound.